Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are no heroes, or so they say. For 10,000 years, humanity has teetered on the brink of extinction, assailed from all sides by horrors beyond imagination. Alien civilizations seek to devour or enslave what remains of mankind's scattered empire. Demons claw at the fabric of reality itself, eager to drag entire worlds into nightmare. And within the Imperium, corruption festers like a wound that will not heal, as the very institutions meant to protect humanity become instruments of oppression and decay. 10,000 years. Think about that span of time. When the Horus heresy tore the galaxy apart, when the Emperor was entombed upon his golden throne, when the dream of human unity shattered into a million pieces, the age we call antiquity had not yet begun. Civilizations have risen and fallen in that time. Entire cultures have been born, flourished, and been utterly forgotten. Technologies that once seemed like miracles have become religious mysteries, their workings no longer understood, but merely repeated like holy litanies. The very Imperium that the Emperor sought to build, a secular empire of reason and progress, has transformed into something he would scarcely recognize. A theocratic nightmare where he himself is worshipped as a god, the very thing he fought against. And yet, buried within this decay, sleeping in chambers unknown to almost all, were secrets. Secrets that could change everything. Secrets that held the potential to shift the balance of this eternal war, if only they could be awakened. For you see, humanity's greatest champions, the demigod sons of the Emperor himself, the Primarchs, did not all perish in the flames of the heresy. Some survived. Some fell to chaos and became demon princes, twisted mockeries of what they once were. But others simply vanished, their fates unknown, their ultimate destinies shrouded in mystery and legend. Of all these lost sons, few were as enigmatic as the first. Lion L. Johnson, Primarch of the Dark Angels, the Emperor's prototype for all Space Marines who would follow. A warrior of unmatched skill, a strategist whose tactical brilliance was rivaled only by his brother Horus before his fall. A knight in the truest sense, raised on a death world by monastic orders who taught him honor and duty, who cleansed his homeworld of monsters that had plagued it for generations. The Lion was everything a Primarch should be. Noble, powerful, utterly devoted to the Emperor's vision. But he was also secretive, taciturn, difficult to know, even for his own sons. Where other Primarchs wore their hearts on their sleeves, the Lion kept his counsel close. Where others built bonds of brotherhood through shared confidences, the Lion maintained a distance that even his closest companions could not bridge. This reserve, this inability or unwillingness to truly connect, would prove to be his undoing. For when the galaxy burned and brother turned against brother, when the Dark Angels themselves fractured, and Caliban, their homeworld, became the site of civil war, the Lion found himself facing his oldest friend, his mentor, the man who had given him his very name, Luther. Their duel shattered a planet. The psychic energies unleashed were so powerful that reality itself buckled under the strain. But when the dust settled and the Dark Angels searched the ruins, they found Luther, his mind broken, babbling about forgiveness and return. But of the Lion, there was no sign. The Primarch had simply vanished, as if he had never existed at all. Only Luther's mad ramblings suggested a different fate, that the Watchers in the dark, those mysterious hooded figures who had long haunted the shadows of Caliban, had taken the Lion away. That one day he would return. 10,000 years passed. Generations of Dark Angels lived and died, each swearing the same oaths, each hunting the same enemies. The fallen, those brothers who had stood with Luther against their Primarch. The hunt for the fallen became an obsession, a shame so deep that it consumed the entire chapter and all its successor organizations. The Inner Circle, and those who knew the terrible secret of the Legion's betrayal would stop at nothing to capture every last fallen, to extract confessions, to hide the truth from the rest of the Imperium. And through it all, deep within the rock, the mobile fortress monastery that was all that remained of Caliban, the lions slept. Only the Emperor and the Watchers in the dark knew the truth. The Primarch had not died. He had not been claimed by chaos. He had been preserved, kept in a state of suspension, waiting for the day when humanity would need him most. And as the 42nd millennium dawned, as the galaxy split in two and the Great Rift tore reality asunder, as Reboot Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar, awoke from his own long sleep to find an Imperium on the brink of collapse, that day was fast approaching. But the Lion's awakening would not be like his brothers. Guilliman had been preserved in stasis, his body unchanging, kept in perfect condition by ancient technology. When he awoke, he was the same man who had fallen to the plague god's champion millennia before. The Lion's rest had been different, deeper, more mysterious. When his eyes finally opened in the 42nd millennium, he would find himself not in the rock, not surrounded by his sons, but in a place that should not exist. A reflection of a world long dead, a forest that existed between reality and dream. The Lion's return would shake the foundations of the Imperium. But more than that, it would challenge everything the Dark Angels believed about their past, their purpose, and their future. For the Lion who awakened was not quite the same man who had fallen 10,000 years before. Time, even in sleep, changes all things. And the galaxy he would return to was darker, more desperate, and in greater need of heroes than it had ever been. This is the story of that awakening, the story of how the first returned to lead his sons once more, the story of redemption and reunion, of battles fought in the shadows between stars, of a quest to protect what little remains of humanity's light in an ocean of darkness. This is the story of when the Lion finally woke up. The death world of Caliban. To understand the Lion's awakening, we must first understand his beginning. Before there was a Primarch, before there was a Legion, before there was even a boy with a name, there was only survival. The infant who would become Lion L. Johnson arrived on Caliban in the most inauspicious of circumstances, alone, defenseless by mortal standards, cast into one of the most hostile environments in the entire galaxy. Caliban was a death world. That classification alone should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of place it was. But let me paint you a picture. Imagine a planet covered in dense forests, so thick that in many places the canopy blocks out the sun entirely. These were not the friendly woods of Terra's ancient past, no gentle groves where one might hunt deer or gather berries. These were forests warped by proximity to the eye of Terra, twisted by energies that leaked from the warp itself. The trees grew massive and gnarled, their roots delving deep into soil, tainted by forces that humanity was not meant to comprehend. And in these forests dwelt beasts, not simple predators, but creatures that had been changed by the warp's touch. Some were remnants of old Earth fauna, brought to Caliban during humanity's first expansion among the stars, now mutated beyond recognition. Others were things that should not exist at all, beings that defied natural law, that seemed to have crawled from nightmare into flesh. They were massive, powerful, and utterly hostile to human life. The greatest of these were the Calibanite lions, massive predators whose roars could shake the very ground, whose claws could tear through stone. Humanity clung to existence on Caliban, in fortress monasteries, massive structures built in clearings hacked from the hostile forest. But the planet had regressed during the Age of Strife, when warp storms cut off all human worlds from each other for thousands of years. The advanced technology that had once connected Caliban to the greater human empire was lost or forgotten. What remained was a feudal society, with warrior orders, knightly brotherhoods who trained in martial arts and codes of honor, serving as the only defense against the beasts of the forest. Into this world, an infant Primarch fell from the sky. The Chaos Gods had scattered the Emperor's sons across the galaxy, in an act of cosmic spite, and Caliban received the first. But unlike many of his brothers, who landed near human settlements or were quickly found by those who would raise them, the lion's capsule came down in the deepest, darkest part of the forest, far from any human habitation. For 10 years, the child survived alone. 10 years. Let that sink in for a moment. A human child, no matter how enhanced by the Emperor's genetic engineering, surviving for a decade in an environment where even armored knights feared to tread for more than a few hours. The beasts of Caliban were not simple animals that could be outwitted or avoided. They were apex predators, some possessed of an intelligence that bordered on malevolence. And yet, not only did the young primarch survive, he thrived. We have no records of those 10 years. The lion himself never spoke of them, not even to Luther, the man who would become his closest friend and greatest betrayer. What horrors did he face in that endless green twilight? What did he eat? How did he find shelter from the elements and the creatures that stalked the night? Did he learn to hunt them? But this child god alone in the wilderness? Or did something in his very nature, some aspect of the warp craft that the Emperor had woven into his creation, protect him from the worst of what Caliban could throw at him? What we do know is that legends began to circulate among the knightly orders, stories of a small figure, pale as moonlight, that haunted the deepest forests. Some said it was a spirit, others a particularly cunning beast. Witnesses who claimed to have seen this phantom described something that moved with inhuman grace, that seemed unafraid of the great predators, that watched human hunting parties from the shadows with eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. When a group of knights from the Order, one of the most prestigious warrior brotherhoods on Caliban, finally encountered this mysterious figure during a quest into the deep forest, they were prepared to kill it on sight. They saw what appeared to be a feral child, perhaps 10 years old in appearance, but there was something wrong about him. His eyes held no fear, only a cold calculation as he evaluated these armored warriors who had stumbled into his territory. His body, though that of a child, was perfectly muscled, moving with a predator's economy of motion. And most disturbing of all, he was surrounded by the remains of kills. Great beasts that even experienced knights would have struggled to bring down alone. The knights raised their weapons, convinced they were looking at some new horror spawned by the warp-tainted forests. But one among them, a warrior named Luther, stayed their hands. And Luther had risen high in the order, despite his common birth, elevated by his skill in battle and his natural charisma. Where the lion was a tactical genius, Luther had the gift of understanding people, of inspiring loyalty, of seeing potential where others saw only threat. Luther saw something in that wild child that others missed. Perhaps it was the intelligence in those feral eyes. Perhaps it was something more, some instinctive recognition that this was no ordinary human, no simple child. Whatever the reason, Luther convinced his brothers to lower their weapons. And then, slowly, carefully, he began to speak to the boy, not as one would speak to an animal or a simpleton, but as one might address an equal who simply did not yet share your language. The child, and we must remember that despite his survival and his prowess, he was still just a child, responded. Not with words at first, those would come later, learned with the supernatural speed that marked all primarchs, but with attention, with curiosity. Luther offered food, though the child clearly did not need it, having fed himself quite adequately on the bounty of the forest. He offered shelter, warmth, companionship, and gradually, over hours that stretched into days, the wild child of the forest allowed himself to be coaxed from his solitary existence. Luther brought the boy back to the fortress monastery of the order, and there named him Lion L. Johnson. In the old Calibanite tongue, it meant the lion, son of the forest. It was a name that honored both his ferocity, for even at that young age, his prowess in combat was remarkable, and his origin, as this child who had somehow survived alone in the most hostile environment imaginable. The name would prove prophetic in ways Luther could never have imagined. Within the fortress monastery, the young Lion L. Johnson adapted to civilized life with remarkable speed. This was another trait of the Primarchs, an almost supernatural ability to learn and grow. Where a normal child would have taken years to learn language, the lion mastered it in weeks. Where martial training that took knights decades to perfect seemed to come to him almost instinctively. He absorbed knowledge like a sponge, everything from military strategy to codes of honor to the intricate political dynamics of Caliban's feudal society. But he never quite lost that reserve, that distance that came from spending his formative years alone. Where Luther could charm a room with a smile and a well-placed word, the lion remained taciturn, speaking only when he had something of value to contribute. Where Luther understood the human heart and could navigate the emotional currents of any situation, the lion saw only tactics and strategies. He was brilliant, perhaps the most brilliant tactical mind that Caliban had ever seen, but he struggled with the simple human connections that came so easily to his adopted mentor. Luther and the lion became partners, almost like father and son, though their relationship was more complex than such simple terms could capture. Luther had the charisma, the political acumen, the ability to unite the various knightly orders of Caliban under a common cause. The lion had the strategic genius, the combat prowess, the ability to see victory where others saw only chaos. Together, they were unstoppable, and Caliban needed them to be unstoppable. For the great beasts, the warp-tainted horrors that had plagued humanity for generations, were growing bolder. Attacks on the fortress monasteries increased. Entire villages disappeared into the forest, their inhabitants dragged away by creatures that grew larger and more terrible with each passing year. It became clear that unless something was done, unless the threat was met head-on, rather than simply defended against, humanity's hold on Caliban would eventually be broken. Luther proposed a grand crusade, not just the Order, but all the knightly brotherhoods of Caliban, united in a single purpose, to cleanse the forests of the great beasts once and for all. He traveled from fortress to fortress, using his considerable powers of persuasion to convince proud warriors to set aside their ancient rivalries and fight together. Many agreed, swayed by Luther's eloquence and the undeniable logic of his argument. But some remained skeptical until they saw the lion in action. The lion led the armies of Caliban into the deep forest, into places where even the bravest knights had feared to venture. He fought with a ferocity that seemed almost inhuman, cutting through the great beasts like they were nothing more than ordinary prey. But more than his personal prowess, it was his strategic brilliance that turned the tide. He understood these creatures in a way that others did not, perhaps because he had lived among them, had learned their patterns and behaviors during his decade alone in the wild. He knew where they laired, how they hunted, but what tactics would draw them out and expose their weaknesses. The crusade took years, but when it was done, Caliban was transformed. The great beasts were not extinct. Such a feat would have been impossible, but they were broken, scattered, reduced to isolated pockets that no longer posed an existential threat to human civilization. For the first time in generations, people could walk through the forests without armored protection. New settlements sprang up in areas that had been considered hopelessly wild. It was a golden age for Caliban, and at its heart stood the lion. In recognition of his achievements, the warrior brotherhoods of Caliban offered the lion a title, Supreme Grand Master of the Order. It was the highest honor they could bestow, leadership over the most prestigious of all the knightly orders. The lion accepted, but with his acceptance came a demand. All the other knightly orders, every brotherhood on Caliban, would swear fealty to him and the Order. Those who refused would be considered enemies of the new peace. Most agreed. How could they not? The lion had led them to victory, had given them a safer world than any of them had dared hope for. But one order, the Knights of Lupus, refused. They had their own secrets, their own dark purposes. Unknown to most of Caliban, they had discovered ancient warp technology, remnants of the dark age of technology, and had begun to dabble in forces that no mortal should touch. They worshipped chaos, though they did not know it by that name. The lion did not negotiate with the Knights of Lupus. He did not attempt to bring them around through diplomacy or persuasion. He simply destroyed them, by hunting them down with the same ruthless efficiency he had shown against the great beasts of the forest. It was a dark precedent, a glimpse of the uncompromising nature that would later cause so much conflict during the Horus heresy. The lion saw a threat, evaluated it, and eliminated it. There was no room for doubt, no space for mercy. And so Caliban entered a new era, united under the lion's banner, pacified and prosperous. But this golden age would not last. For above Caliban, undetected by any censor or watchman, ships were approaching. Ships from beyond the stars, carrying warriors clad in grey armor. The Emperor's forward scouts had found Caliban, and they were about to find something even more valuable. One of the lost Primarchs. The Great Crusade and Seeds of Betrayal. When the Emperor's ships arrived at Caliban, the reunion between father and son was immediate and powerful. The lion, standing in the fortress monastery that had been his home for years, felt the Emperor's presence before any mortal senses could detect the approaching fleet. It was like a light in the darkness, a connection that transcended mere psychic communication. The Emperor had crafted the Primarchs from his own genetic material, woven his own essence into their creation. There was a bond there that could not be denied, could not be severed. The lion knew, without being told, without any need for explanation, that his true purpose had arrived. Everything on Caliban, the crusade against the beasts, the unification of the knightly orders, even his partnership with Luther, had been preparation for this moment. Yet he was meant for something greater than being supreme Grand Master of a single world. He was meant to lead armies among the stars, to bring the Emperor's vision of unity to the galaxy itself. The meeting between the Emperor and the lion was brief, as these things often were. The Emperor was not one for lengthy emotional exchanges. He had 17 other sons to find, a galaxy to conquer, and enemies that would not wait for sentiment. He saw in the lion exactly what he had hoped to create: a warrior of unparalleled skill, a strategist whose brilliance could change the course of battles, a leader who commanded absolute loyalty. The Emperor informed the lion of his true nature, his place in the grand design, and offered him command of the First Legion. The First Legion, the very name carried weight. They were the prototype, the original design, from which all other Space Marine legions would be derived. They had been fighting the Emperor's wars for decades before any of the other Primarchs were found, earning a reputation for ruthless efficiency and an almost unnerving level of secrecy. They were veterans in the truest sense, hardened by countless campaigns, loyal to the core but also insular, difficult to truly know. In many ways, they were perfect for the lion. But the lion did not immediately abandon Caliban. There were things to be done, preparations to be made. The Emperor's scientists, the gene wrights who could transform suitable candidates into space marines, arrived on the planet. The Knights of the Order, these warriors who had fought beside the lion in his crusade, were offered a chance to join the Legion. Many were young enough to undergo the full transformation into Astartes. Others, like Luther, were too old for the complete process, but could still be enhanced through genetic modification, made stronger and longer-lived, if not quite equal to a true space marine. This was where the seeds of future tragedy were planted. Luther, who had found the lion, who had named him and mentored him and stood beside him in the crusade to save Caliban, was deemed too old to become a full space marine. He would be modified, yes, enhanced beyond normal human limits, but he would never be the lion's equal in the way that a true Astartes might be. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and though Luther accepted it with outward grace, something inside him began to change. The lion left Caliban with the Emperor and the bulk of the First Legion, now renamed the Dark Angels in honor of an old Calibanite legend. He left Luther behind as his second-in-command, responsible for continuing to recruit and train new space marines from Caliban and sending them to join the crusade. It seemed like a position of honor and trust. Luther was to be the master of their homeworld, the one who would ensure a steady stream of fresh warriors for the Great Crusade. But Luther saw it differently. While the lion traveled among the stars, winning glory in the emperor's name, Luther was stuck on Caliban, doing administrative work. While the lion fought alongside his brother Primarchs, taking part in the great events that would shape the future of humanity, Luther was relegated to training recruits. The resentment festered, fed by whispers from sources Luther did not fully understand. Whispers that asked why he should serve when he could rule. Whispers that reminded him of every slight, every moment when the lion's tactical brilliance overshadowed Luther's charisma. Whispers from the warp itself, from chaos, always eager to turn loyalty into betrayal. The lion, meanwhile, threw himself into the Great Crusade with the same focused intensity he had brought to everything else in his life. The Dark Angels became known as one of the most effective legions, perhaps the most effective in terms of pure military achievement. They conquered systems with ruthless efficiency, never wasting lives needlessly, but never hesitating when sacrifice was required. The lion's strategic genius was on full display in campaign after campaign, but he made few friends among his brother Primarchs. His secretive nature, his reluctance to share his thoughts or plans, even with those who were supposed to be his equals, bred suspicion. He quarreled with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves over matters of honor and protocol. He clashed with Rabute Gilliman over strategic priorities. Only a few Primarchs, like Horus and Sanguinius, seemed able to truly connect with the lion on any meaningful level. When Horus was named War Master, given overall command of the Great Crusade, the lion accepted it with stoic resignation. He had perhaps hoped for the position himself, knowing that his achievements in battle certainly qualified him for it. But he also recognized, as his brother Leman Russ did, that Horus was the emperor's favorite. There was no point in protesting, no benefit in showing resentment. The lion simply continued doing what he did best, winning wars. Then came the betrayal. Horus turned against the emperor, and the galaxy burned. Fully half of the Primarchs revealed their allegiance to chaos, and the Great Crusade became the Horus heresy. Brother fought brother, legion fought legion, and everything the emperor had built seemed poised to collapse into ruin. The lion found himself on the far side of the galaxy when the heresy began, prosecuting a campaign against the Night Lords and their Primarch, Konrad Curze. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that seemed designed specifically to keep the Dark Angels tied up and unable to aid the Loyalists at Terra. This was part of Horus's strategy, to delay as many loyal legions as possible, to ensure that when he finally struck at the Emperor, there would be no one to stand in his way. The lion fought his way through the Thramas Crusade with characteristic brilliance, but he was trapped. A warp storm, the Ruin Storm, had been deliberately created by chaos to cut off entire sections of the galaxy from each other. He could not reach Terra, could not come to the Emperor's aid. Instead, he joined forces with two of his brothers, Rabute Gilliman and Sanguinius, in a region called Imperium Secundus, a backup empire created in case Terra fell. It was during this time that the lion's secretive nature and difficulty trusting others nearly tore the Loyalists apart. He captured Konrad Curze, but the Night Haunter escaped and wreaked havoc across Ultramar, causing catastrophic damage before he was finally recaptured. The lion blamed himself, his inability to simply execute Curze when he had the chance, his adherence to forms of honor and protocol that Curze gleefully exploited. When the Ruin Storm finally dissipated and the way to Terra opened once more, the lion raced to reach the throne world, but he was too late. By the time the Dark Angels arrived, the siege was over. Horus was dead, struck down by the Emperor, but the Emperor himself had been mortally wounded, forced to take his place upon the Golden Throne to prevent his own death from dooming all of humanity. The dream was over. The Great Crusade had ended in ashes and blood. The lion attended the councils after the Siege of Terror, where the survivors tried to pick up the pieces. He sided with Rogel Dawn and Lehman Russ in advocating for an immediate crusade of vengeance against the traitors, rather than Guilliman's more cautious approach of consolidation and rebuilding. It was a glimpse of the lion's nature. When faced with enemies, his instinct was always to attack, to destroy, to show no mercy. But ultimately, exhausted by 9 years of continuous warfare, racked with grief over the Emperor's fate and the loss of so many brothers to chaos, the lion returned to Caliban. He needed to see his homeworld, to draw strength from the place where his journey had begun. He needed to reconnect with Luther, his oldest friend, the man who had found him in the forest and given him a name. What he found instead was betrayal beyond imagining. When the Dark Angel's fleet arrived in orbit around Caliban, they were met not with celebrations, but with weapons fire. The planet's defense lasers, meant to protect against invasion, opened fire on the returning legion. The lion, stunned by this inexplicable attack, he had tried to establish communication, to find out what madness had gripped his homeworld. The truth, when it came, was devastating. Luther and the Dark Angels, who had been left on Caliban, had turned against the Imperium. They felt abandoned, forgotten, relegated to garrison duty, while their brothers earned glory among the stars. Chaos had found fertile ground in their resentment, whispering promises of power and recognition. They had declared independence from the Imperium, from the Emperor, and from the Lion himself. The Lion's response was fury incarnate. He ordered an orbital bombardment of the very world he had once fought to save, unleashing the full might of the Dark Angel's fleet against the fortress monasteries that had been his home. He led a personal assault on Luther's stronghold, teleporting down with his most elite warriors to confront his former friend and mentor. The duel between Luther and the Lion was apocalyptic. These were not just two warriors fighting. This was the culmination of years of resentment and misunderstanding. Friendship turned to hatred. Love corrupted into betrayal.
You know, I have to say the way Games Workshop brought the Lion back is honestly one of my favorite Primarch returns in the lore. Unlike Guilliman's resurrection, which was this grand galaxy-shaking event with the Eldar and the Emperor's direct intervention, the Lion just wakes up, alone, confused, in a forest that shouldn't exist. And I think that's so much more fitting for his character. This is the guy who spent his first 10 years surviving completely alone in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Of course, when he returns, he doesn't need fanfare or armies or anyone to hold his hand. He just gets up and starts hunting again. Because that's what he does. That's who he is. What really gets me though is how they handled the Fallen. For decades, the Dark Angel's obsession with hunting these guys has been their defining threat, right? But the Lion comes back and immediately sees through it. He realizes that not everyone who was on Caliban was actually a traitor. Some were just caught up in Luther's madness. And instead of continuing this 10,000 witch hunt, he offers them redemption. That's growth. But anyway, let's continue the video.
Luther, empowered by the gifts of chaos, was far stronger than he should have been. He channeled energies that mortal flesh was never meant to contain, striking at the Lion with a fury born of decades of suppressed anger. The Lion fought back with all his considerable skill and power, but Luther's chaos-enhanced abilities were too much. In a final, desperate gambit, Luther unleashed a psychic attack of staggering magnitude, a blast of pure warp energy that struck the Lion and sent him crashing to the ground, mortally wounded. Yet for a moment, it seemed as if the first Primarch would fall, killed by the very man who had saved him all those years ago in the forest. But then something happened. As Luther stood over the fallen Lion, as he prepared to deliver the killing blow, it was as if a veil was lifted from his eyes. He saw, truly saw, what he had done. This was his friend, his brother in all but blood, the child he had saved and raised and fought beside. And Luther had nearly killed him, would have killed him, all for the empty promises of powers that cared nothing for him or Caliban or anything but their own dark amusement. The realization shattered Luther's sanity. He fell to his knees beside the Lion's body, no longer willing or able to fight. And in that moment, the Chaos Gods realized they had been denied yet another prize. In their rage and frustration, as they lashed out at Caliban itself, a warp storm of unprecedented magnitude engulfed the planet, tearing at reality with forces that should not exist in the material universe. The very fabric of space buckled under the assault. Caliban broke apart. The entire planet shattered, destroyed by the same chaotic energies that had corrupted it for so long. Only the fortress monastery of the Order, protected by ancient force fields, survived the cataclysm. When the storm finally dissipated and the Dark Angel's fleet was able to return, they found that the once beautiful world had been reduced to a barren asteroid, which they would thereafter call the Rock. On the surface of the Rock, they found Luther, alive but completely mad, babbling incoherently about forgiveness and return. They found many of the Dark Angels who had stood with Luther, though most had been scattered by the warp storm, cast into the void to emerge at random points across space and time. These would become known as the Fallen, and hunting them down would become the Dark Angel's obsession for the next 10,000 years. But of the Lion, there was no sign. The Primarch had simply vanished, as if he had never existed. Luther, in his few moments of lucidity, claimed that the Watchers in the dark had taken him, that mysterious beings who had haunted Caliban since time immemorial had spirited the Lion away to safety. He insisted, with the certainty of madness, that the Lion would one day return, that he would forgive Luther for his sins, that redemption was possible. The Dark Angels did not know what to believe. They searched the Rock thoroughly, desperately seeking any trace of their Primarch. And they found nothing, and so they chose to believe he was dead, killed by Luther's final attack, his body perhaps atomized by the warp storm. It was a grief they would carry for 10,000 years, a loss that would define them as a chapter more than any victory or campaign. But Luther had spoken truth, even in his madness. Deep within the Rock, in chambers so hidden that even the chapter masters who succeeded him did not know of their existence, the Lion slept. The Watchers in the dark had indeed taken him, preserving his life in ways that defied understanding. Only they and the Emperor, sitting in silent vigil upon his golden throne, knew that the First still lived. And they waited. They waited for the day when the galaxy would need the Lion once more, but when the darkness would grow so deep that even his light would be necessary to pierce it. They waited for 10,000 years, patient as only immortal beings can be. They waited for the Lion to wake. The long sleep and the changing galaxy. For 10,000 years, the Lion slept in chambers unknown to his sons, preserved by the mysterious Watchers in the dark, in ways that even the most learned scholars of the Imperium could not have explained. It was not the sleep of stasis, the kind that had preserved Robut Guilliman in perfect, unchanging stillness. This was something deeper, stranger, more fundamental. The Lion's body aged slowly during those millennia, his features growing harder, more weathered, as if each century left its mark even in slumber. But his dreams were another matter entirely. As while his body rested in the deepest vaults of the Rock, the Lion's consciousness wandered in places that existed between the real and the unreal. His mind touched upon the warp, that roiling ocean of psychic energy that underlies reality itself, but it did not drown in chaos as mortal minds would. Instead, he found himself in a place that would later be called Mirror Caliban, a reflection of his lost homeworld as it had been before the fall, before Luther's betrayal, before the forests had been conquered and tamed. In these dreams, the Lion walked through forests that no longer existed in the material universe. He hunted beasts that had been extinct for millennia. He relived moments from his youth, but changed, twisted, made strange by the nature of the realm he occupied. Sometimes he saw himself as that feral child of 10 years, surviving alone in the wilderness. Sometimes he was the Knight Commander, leading crusades against the great beasts. And sometimes he was something else entirely, something that existed outside of linear time, observing his own life from a perspective that would have driven a normal human mad. The Watchers in the Dark visited him in these dreams, though to call them visits might be misleading. They existed in Mirror Caliban as naturally as they had once existed on the real Caliban, those strange hooded figures whose origins and purposes remained shrouded in mystery. They spoke to the lion in riddles and prophecies, in warnings and portents that he could not quite understand in his dreaming state. They prepared him, in their own enigmatic way, for the awakening that would eventually come. While the lion slept and dreamed, the galaxy changed around him. The Imperium that he would eventually return to bore little resemblance to the one he had left. The Emperor's vision of a secular empire of reason had long since been abandoned, replaced by the ecclesiarchy, a massive religious institution that worshipped the Emperor as a god, the very thing he had fought against during the Great Crusade. The imperial truth, the idea that there were no gods and that humanity must reject superstition in favor of logic and science, had been buried beneath layer after layer of religious dogma and mysticism. Technology stagnated and then began its long decline. The knowledge of how to create many of the wonders of the dark age of technology was lost, preserved only in scattered standard template constructs that were treated as holy relics. The tech priests of Mars, who maintained what technology remained, performed their duties as religious rites rather than scientific procedures, more concerned with appeasing machine spirits than understanding how things actually worked. The Space Marines themselves changed. The original legions were broken apart after the heresy, divided into smaller chapters to prevent any one leader from wielding the kind of power that Horus had commanded. The Dark Angels, like all the legions, was split into dozens of successor chapters, each maintaining some connection to their origins, but developing their own identities over the millennia. But all of them, every single chapter that traced its lineage back to the First Legion, carried the same burden: the hunt for the fallen. When the Dark Angel's obsession with capturing and interrogating the fallen became the defining characteristic of the chapter and its successors. The inner circle, those who knew the full truth about the betrayal on Caliban, would go to any lengths to prevent that secret from becoming known. Entire campaigns were abandoned mid-battle if word came of a fallen sighting. Allied forces were left to their fate if pursuing them might reveal the truth. The Dark Angels developed a reputation for being unreliable, secretive, and potentially treacherous. Ironic, given that they were trying to hide an ancient treachery among their ranks. Century after century, the inner circle hunted the fallen across the galaxy. They captured them when they could, interrogated them in the deepest dungeons of the rock, or sought to extract confessions of their sins before executing them or, in rare cases, accepting them back into the fold. But the fallen were scattered across space and time, emerging at random intervals, some repentant and seeking redemption, others fully embraced by chaos and eager to strike at their former brothers. Luther himself remained imprisoned deep within the rock, in cells that were close to, but not adjacent to where the lions slept. He was kept alive through means unknown, his body sustained by technologies that predated the Imperium itself. Successive supreme grand masters of the Dark Angels visited him, seeking answers, trying to extract some useful intelligence about the fallen or their whereabouts. But Luther would only babble about forgiveness and return, insisting with deranged certainty that the lion lived and would one day wake. Most considered Luther's ravings to be nothing more than the desperate fantasies of a broken mind. The lion was dead, killed in the duel, his body lost to the warp storm that destroyed Caliban. That was the official position, the belief held by all but a very select few who had access to the deepest secrets of the rock. But those few knew better. They knew that somewhere in the hidden chambers, the Primarch slept on, waiting for a day that might never come. The galaxy itself grew darker with each passing millennium. The age of strife that had preceded the Great Crusade had been a time of isolation and regression. But at least humanity had been united in its ignorance. In the 10,000 years following the heresy, yet the Imperium became something different, a vast bureaucratic nightmare, corrupt and inefficient, held together more by inertia and sheer bloody-mindedness than by any coherent vision or purpose. Xenos races that had been thought defeated during the Great Crusade regained their strength. The green-skinned menace that humans simply called the Orcs multiplied across thousands of worlds, creating massive empires that crashed against Imperial space in never-ending waves. The Aeldari, the ancient race of psychic beings who had once ruled the galaxy, skulked in their hidden craft worlds and webway refuges, launching raids against human colonies for reasons that made sense only to their alien minds. The Tau, a young and idealistic race in the Eastern Fringe, expanded their empire with visions of a greater good that had no place for human freedom. And then there were the Tyranids, a horror from beyond the galaxy itself. Vast fleets of bioships carrying trillions of alien organisms, all controlled by a hive intelligence of terrifying scope and power. They came to consume, to strip planets of all biological matter, to add the genetic material of conquered races to their own ever-evolving forms. World after world fell to their hunger, and the Imperium seemed powerless to stop them. But perhaps the greatest threat came from chaos itself. The warp, always dangerous, became increasingly unstable. Demon incursions grew more frequent and more powerful. The Cadian Gate, a stable route through the warp storms near the Eye of Terror, became a perpetual war zone as the forces of chaos launched Black Crusade after Black Crusade, trying to break through and flood into Imperial space. While for 10,000 years, the Imperium held on, barely, desperately, losing ground century by century but never quite falling into complete collapse. It was a slow death, an empire in terminal decline, maintained only by the sacrifice of countless billions of lives. Every day, thousands of psychers were fed to the Golden Throne to keep the Emperor's fragile existence sustained. Every day, millions of Imperial guardsmen died in trenches and bunkers across 1 million different wars. Every day, the Imperium grew a little weaker, a little more corrupt, a little closer to final collapse. And through it all, the Lion slept on in his hidden chamber, dreaming dreams that spanned millennia, walking through forests that existed only in the strange realm between reality and warp. The Watchers kept their vigil, patient as stone, waiting for signs that only they could interpret. And the Emperor, locked in his eternal torment upon the Golden Throne, was aware of his sleeping son, waiting for the day when that slumber would finally end. That day came in the 42nd Millennium, when the galaxy split in two and darkness covered half of all human worlds. It came when the forces of chaos seemed poised to finally overwhelm the Imperium's weakening defenses. It came when Reboot Guilliman, the first Primarch to return to the Imperium in 10,000 years, found himself leading an empire he barely recognized against enemies that seemed impossible to defeat. It came when the Lion finally opened his eyes. The awakening in Mirror Caliban. The Lion's awakening was not a sudden thing, not a dramatic moment of eyes snapping open and consciousness flooding back. Instead, it was gradual, like the slow transition from deep sleep to wakefulness, except stretched across days or perhaps weeks. Time had little meaning in the place where he found himself. At first, there was only sensation without comprehension. The smell of the forest, rich and loamy. The sound of leaves rustling in a breeze. The dappled light filtering through a dense canopy. These were familiar things, echoes of his earliest memories, but they felt wrong somehow, too perfect, too deliberately arranged, like a stage set rather than natural growth. Slowly, awareness crystallized. The Lion became conscious of himself as a being separate from his surroundings. He had a body, though it felt strange, different from what he remembered, heavier perhaps, older. His hands, when he looked at them, were weathered, marked by age in ways that should not have been possible for a Primarch. How long had he been asleep? He tried to remember what had happened before the sleep, there had been Luther, the duel, the pain of betrayal far worse than any physical wound, Caliban burning, the warp storm, and then nothing, or rather, not nothing, but a long period of dreaming that he could not quite separate from waking. Had any of that been real? Was this? The lion stood, finding himself in a forest that was intimately familiar yet somehow alien. These were the woods of Caliban. He was certain of that. The massive trees with their twisted trunks, the thick undergrowth, the perpetual twilight created by the dense canopy, all exactly as he remembered from his youth. But Caliban was gone, destroyed by the warp storm that had followed his battle with Luther. This could not be Caliban. And yet, here he was, walking through forests that should not exist, breathing air that tasted of home, feeling the familiar give of forest loam beneath his feet. The lion had faced many strange things in his long life, had traveled the warp and seen the impossible made manifest. But this was different. This felt like something ancient, something that predated even the Chaos God's corruption of reality. He began to walk, following instincts honed during his 10 years of solitary survival. The forest had pathways if you knew how to read them, places where the trees grew less densely, where the undergrowth was thinner, where game trails suggested routes through the wilderness. The lion followed these paths, not because he had a destination in mind, but because remaining still felt wrong. He was a hunter, and hunters moved. It wasn't long before he heard the sound of running water. A river, by the sound of it, flowing swift and clear through the forest. The lion approached cautiously, habits from his feral youth reasserting themselves. Water sources attracted prey, but they also attracted predators. Even in this strange dream forest, caution seemed wise. What he found at the river was something he did not expect. An old man sat on the bank, fishing with a simple rod and line. His posture suggested both patience and pain. There was something wrong with him, some injury or illness that marked him even from a distance. As the lion drew closer, he could see that the man was pale, almost grey, and that dark shadows seemed to coil around him like living things. The man turned his head, acknowledging the lion's presence with eyes that held depths of sorrow. He did not speak, did not move to greet this massive armored figure emerging from the forest. He simply returned his attention to the water, to the line disappearing beneath the surface, to whatever fish or phantoms he might catch in this impossible place. The lion tried to approach, tried to cross the distance between them, but the shadows around the old man grew thicker, more aggressive. They were not merely the absence of light, but something more substantial, entities with malevolent purpose. They warned the lion back, made it clear that the old man was not to be disturbed. Frustrated but recognizing a mystery he could not immediately solve, the lion turned away from the river. He continued deeper into the forest, following paths that seemed to call to him. That felt significant in ways he could not articulate. And it was there, in a clearing beneath ancient trees, that he encountered the Watchers. They appeared as they always had, small hooded figures, barely reaching the lion's waist, their faces hidden in shadow. The lion had seen them before, during his time on Caliban, though they had been rare even then, appearing and disappearing without explanation. Most humans could not see them at all, or if they did, dismissed them as tricks of light or figments of imagination. But the lion had always been aware of them, had always known that these beings were real, were important, were connected to Caliban in fundamental ways. One of the Watchers stepped forward, and when it spoke, its voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Home," it said. As in answer to a question the lion had not yet asked. "You are home." "This is not Caliban," the lion replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Caliban is gone, destroyed." "And yet you stand in its forests," the Watcher replied, with the maddening circular logic that seemed characteristic of their kind. "This is Mirror Caliban, a reflection of what was, preserved in places between the real and unreal. You have slept here for many years, walked here in dreams, though you do not remember." The lion processed this information with the tactical mind that had served him so well during the Great Crusade, a realm that existed between reality and the warp, a reflection of his lost homeworld. It made a certain kind of sense, given what he knew of the warp and its strange properties. The question was why? Why had he been brought here? Oh, why preserved in this manner? "The man at the river," the lion said. "The fisher king with the wound. What is his significance?" "He is what he appears to be," the watcher replied. "A king in pain, waiting for the right question to be asked, for healing to be offered. But you are not ready, not yet, to understand what must be done for him." The lion wanted to press for more information, but before he could speak, the watcher gestured toward a structure visible through the trees. A domed building, ancient and weathered, standing in a clearing. The lion recognized the architecture. It was Calibanite, built in the style of the fortress monasteries from before the emperor's arrival. "Go there if you wish," the watcher said, "but know that you are not yet strong enough to face what lies within. Follow your nature, Lionel Johnson. Hunt the corruption that festers in this realm. Grow strong again. Remember who and what you are, and when the time comes, you will know what must be done." Before the lion could respond, the watcher vanished, simply ceasing to exist in one moment and gone in the next. The lion was left alone in the clearing, faced with a choice. He could enter the domed building, could confront whatever mysteries it held despite the watcher's warning. Or he could follow the advice given, could hunt in this strange forest, could rediscover himself through the fundamental activity that had defined his earliest years. The lion chose to hunt. It was, as the watcher had said, his nature. He could smell corruption in the forest, a taint that was not merely the natural decay of organic matter, but something more sinister, at the same kind of warp-touched wrongness that had afflicted the great beasts of Caliban in his youth. If this was a reflection of his homeworld, then perhaps it held reflections of those ancient enemies as well. And so the lion began to walk the forests of Mirror Caliban, seeking out the sources of corruption. He found them, twisted creatures that were mockeries of natural life, things that had been warped by chaos into forms that defied description. He fought them with his bare hands at first, rediscovering the savage joy of close combat, of pitting himself against powerful enemies without the benefit of weapons or armor. It was purifying in its way, a return to the essence of what he had been before Luther found him. As he hunted, memories began to return, fragments at first, disconnected images and sensations. Was the feel of power armor sealing around him for the first time, the weight of responsibility as the emperor handed him command of the First Legion, the pride and satisfaction of victories won during the Great Crusade, the growing unease as he sensed that not all of his brothers were as loyal as they should be, the horror of the heresy, of watching the Imperium tear itself apart. And with the memories came understanding. He had not simply been asleep, he had been healing, in both body and spirit. The wound Luther had inflicted, the psychic attack that should have killed him, had been so severe that it required more than normal Primarch resilience to survive. The Watchers had preserved him, had placed him in this realm where time flowed strangely, where he could recover from injuries that would have been fatal anywhere else. But recovery alone was not enough. The lion needed to remember who he was, what he was capable of, what his purpose had always been, and so he hunted. And in hunting, he rediscovered himself, the tactical genius that could assess a situation in moments and formulate the perfect response, the combat prowess that made him a match for any enemy, the unwavering determination that would let him pursue a goal no matter what obstacles stood in his way. The lion did not know how long he spent in Mirror Caliban. Time had no meaning in this place, or rather, it had a different meaning than in the material world. Days might have been years, or minutes might have been decades, but eventually, following trails of corruption through the impossible forests, the lion emerged from Mirror Caliban and found himself in the material universe once more. Or he stood on a planet he did not recognize, in the ruins of what had once been an imperial settlement. The bodies of cultists lay scattered around him, slain by his own hands in a battle he had fought almost without conscious thought as he transitioned between the dream realm and reality. And kneeling before him, wounded and surrounded by the corpses of his enemies, was a dark angel. But this was no loyal son of the Lion. This was one of the fallen, a traitor who had stood with Luther 10,000 years ago. The Lion should have felt rage, should have struck the fallen Marine down without hesitation. But something about this warrior's posture, his obvious grief and shame, made the Lion pause. And in that pause, recognition struck. Not just recognition of this specific Marine, though memories were surfacing of Zabriel as a warrior who had fought beside the Lion during the Great Crusade, but a deeper understanding, a realization that shook the very foundations of everything the Lion thought he knew about the betrayal on Caliban. Not all of the fallen had chosen to betray. Not all had embraced chaos willingly. Many had simply been caught up in events beyond their control, had trusted Luther as their brothers trusted the Lion, had found themselves on the wrong side of a conflict they barely understood. And then, for 10,000 years, they had been hunted by their own brothers, branded as traitors even when their only crime had been loyalty to a leader who himself had been corrupted. The Lion looked at Zabriel, at this warrior who had fought to protect Imperial citizens against a chaos cult, even though he knew that his own brothers would kill him if they found him. And in that moment, the Lion made a choice that would change everything. "Rise, Zabriel," the Lion said, and his voice carried the authority of a Primarch, of a father speaking to his son. "Your sins, if sins they were, are forgiven. Luther's madness was not your doing, and 10,000 years of exile is punishment enough for any crime. I offer you a chance at redemption, at service to the Imperium you never truly abandoned. Will you take it?" Zabriel looked up at the Lion, and tears streamed down his weathered face. He had thought himself damned forever, hunted for crimes he did not commit, forced to hide his true allegiance lest his own brothers execute him without trial. And here stood the Lion, the Primarch himself, offering forgiveness and redemption. "My lord," Zabriel said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have dreamed of this moment for 10,000 years. I will serve. Unto death and beyond, I will serve." And so the first of the risen was gathered to the Lion's side. Not the last, as the Primarch would discover in the days to come, but the first. The beginning of a new brotherhood, forged not from blind loyalty, but from genuine redemption and renewed purpose. But as the Lion stood there with Zabriel, as his memories fully returned and he understood what had happened to him and to the galaxy in the years of his sleep, a terrible realization dawned. He had awakened into a galaxy far darker than the one he had left. The Imperium was falling, had been falling for 10,000 years. His father, as the Emperor, was locked in an endless torment upon the Golden Throne. His brother Guilliman had apparently also returned, though the Lion knew not the details. And more than all of this, the Lion realized that he stood in Imperium Nihilus, the dark side of the galaxy, cut off from Terra and the greater Imperium by the Great Rift, the massive warp storm that had torn reality in two. He was alone here, without the support of his legion, without the guidance of the Emperor, without the resources of the greater Imperium. But as the Lion had learned during his 10 years alone in the forests of Caliban, being alone did not mean being powerless. He had survived then, and he would survive now. More than survive. He would fight back against the darkness. He would protect what little remained of humanity in this benighted realm. He would gather to his side all those who would fight for the Emperor's vision, whether they were loyal dark angels, redeemed fallen, or simple human soldiers determined to hold the line against the endless night. The Lion had awakened, and the galaxy would never be the same. Gathering the risen and the Lion Guard. The Lion's understanding of the fallen changed fundamentally in those first days after his awakening. For 10,000 years, the Dark Angels and their successor chapters had hunted these traitors with fanatical devotion, convinced that every single fallen was a willing servant of chaos who had consciously chosen to betray the Emperor. The inner circle had built an entire mythology around this belief, had made the hunt for the fallen the defining purpose of their existence. But the lion, with his strategic mind and his willingness to see truth even when it was uncomfortable, recognized that this black and white view was fundamentally flawed. Yes, some of the fallen had genuinely embraced chaos. They had followed Luther into damnation knowingly, had sworn allegiance to the dark gods, and had spent the last 10,000 years prosecuting their own wars against the Imperium. These were truly enemies, and the lion would show them no mercy. But others, perhaps the majority, had simply been caught up in events beyond their control. They had been on Caliban when Luther's corruption reached its peak. They had followed orders from their legitimate chain of command, not knowing that those orders came from a man who had been twisted by chaos. And when the planet shattered and the warp storm scattered them across space and time, as they found themselves branded as traitors by their own brothers, hunted without mercy, given no chance to explain or redeem themselves. Some of these fallen had turned to chaos out of desperation, seeing no other path to survival. But others had remained loyal to the Emperor's vision in their hearts, even as they were forced into exile and hiding. They had protected Imperial worlds when they could, fought against chaos when the opportunity arose, and lived quiet lives of penance and prayer when battle was not an option. And for this loyalty, they had been rewarded with nothing but persecution from the very chapter they had once served. The lion decided that this injustice would end. He would offer redemption to any fallen who had not truly embraced chaos, who could demonstrate that their loyalty to the Emperor remained unbroken despite everything they had endured. Those who accepted would be welcomed back, not as dark angels, for that chapter was now something different from what it had been during his time, but as something new. The risen, redeemed warriors who had passed through betrayal and exile and emerged with their honor intact. Zabriel became the lion's emissary in this effort. He knew where other fallen might be found, had maintained a loose network of contacts over the millennia, knew which of his scattered brothers might be amenable to the Primarch's offer of redemption. The lion sent him out into the darkness of Imperium Nihilus with a simple message. The lion has returned. Those who wish to serve may come to him. Those who have truly fallen to chaos will be destroyed. But those who have remained loyal, who have preserved their honor despite everything, will be welcomed home. The response was overwhelming. Fallen who had lived in hiding for thousands of years, always looking over their shoulders, always expecting the interrogator chaplains to find them, suddenly had hope. The Primarch himself offered them a chance to fight openly once more, to serve the Emperor without having to conceal their true identities. Many came immediately, desperate for the chance to prove their loyalty. Others were more cautious, scarred by millennia of persecution, uncertain whether this could truly be real, or was some elaborate trap set by the inner circle. The lion met with each of them personally. He looked into their eyes, read their souls, as only a Primarch could, judged whether their loyalty was genuine or feigned. Those who passed this test were accepted into the risen, given new oaths to swear, new purposes to serve. Those who failed, who showed signs of chaos corruption or genuine treachery, were executed without hesitation. The lion had no patience for true traitors, regardless of their excuses or justifications. As the risen grew in number, the lion began to build something larger. He could not rely solely on space marines, no matter how skilled or loyal. He needed conventional forces as well, human soldiers who could hold ground while the risen struck at high-value targets. He needed scouts and spies, people who could move through Imperial society gathering intelligence. He needed logistical support, supply lines, communication networks. And so the lion began to establish what would become known as the Lion Guard. These were regular humans, drawn from the worlds of Imperium Nihilus, who swore allegiance to the lion personally rather than to the Imperium's normal chain of command. They were soldiers and militia, merchants and administrators, tech priests and preachers. They were anyone who saw in the lion a chance to fight back against the darkness that had swallowed half the galaxy. The lion's approach to leadership was different from what the Imperium had become accustomed to over the millennia. When he arrived on a world, he did not present himself to the planetary governor and work through official channels. Instead, he went directly to the people, to the soldiers in the trenches and the citizens in the streets. He bypassed the corrupt bureaucracy that had become endemic to the Imperium, spoke to those who were actually doing the fighting and dying, and judged for himself whether they were worth defending. If he found the local leadership competent and genuinely concerned with protecting their people, the lion would work with them, offer his aid, and move on when his work was done. But if he found corruption, incompetence, or self-serving behavior that endangered the very people these leaders were supposed to protect, the lion had no hesitation in removing them from power. A Primarch's authority superseded any planetary government, any imperial bureaucrat, any official hierarchy. When the lion decreed that a governor was removed from office, that governor was removed. No appeals, no bureaucratic delays, no political maneuvering. This approach earned the lion a reputation as a champion of the common people, but made him deeply unpopular among the Imperium's ruling classes, while those who had grown fat and comfortable exploiting their positions of power found themselves suddenly accountable to someone who could not be bribed, threatened, or maneuvered against. The lion cared nothing for politics or social status. He cared only for competence and loyalty to the Imperium's true purpose, protecting humanity from extinction. The lion's first major campaign with the Risen was against a chaos warband called the 10,000 Eyes. This force was led by a fallen sorcerer named Seraphax, a marine who had fully embraced chaos and now commanded considerable dark powers. Seraphax had been building his strength in Imperium Nihilus for years, corrupting world after world, building a power base that he intended to use for some dark purpose known only to himself. The 10,000 Eyes had ravaged dozens of worlds, leaving corruption and damnation in their wake. They were cunning, skilled at hitting targets and disappearing before Imperial forces could respond, using their knowledge of Space Marine tactics against the very forces that had once been their brothers. Conventional Imperial forces had tried to stop them and failed repeatedly. The Chaos Marines were simply too fast, too well equipped, too experienced to be caught by normal military operations. But the Lion was not a normal military leader. He understood how Space Marines thought, how they fought, what their strengths and weaknesses were. More than that, he had access to intelligence from Zabriel and other Risen who had once known Seraphax, who could predict his tactics and anticipate his strategies. The Lion set a trap using Imperial worlds as bait, at letting Seraphax think he was raiding undefended targets. When the 10,000 Eyes struck, the Lion struck back. The Risen, moving through the strange forest paths that the Lion had learned to access, appeared from nowhere in the middle of the Chaos Warband's assault. The battle was brutal and swift, with Space Marines fighting Space Marines in close combat, while the Lion Guard provided supporting fire and held the line against cultist hordes. The Lion himself confronted Seraphax in a duel that showcased just how different a Primarch was from even the most powerful Space Marine. The fallen sorcerer threw everything he had at the Lion: psychic assaults that could have shattered a normal mind, corrupted powers granted by dark gods, combat skills honed over 10,000 years of warfare. None of it was enough. The Lion dismantled Seraphax's defenses methodically, struck him down, and ended his threat to Imperium Nihilus permanently. The victory over the 10,000 Eyes was significant not just for the Chaos Warband it eliminated, but for what it represented. The Lion had demonstrated that he could organize effective military operations even without the full resources of the Dark Angels chapter. He had shown that the Risen, these redeemed fallen, could fight alongside loyal Imperial forces without causing the catastrophic conflicts that the Inner Circle had always feared. And he had proven that he was a force to be reckoned with, a power that could change the balance in Imperium Nihilus. As word of the Lion's victories spread, more and more people came to his banner, not just fallen seeking redemption, but entire Imperial Guard regiments who had been cut off from the greater Imperium and left to fend for themselves. Planetary governors who saw in the Lion a chance to actually win against the forces that threatened them, rather than just dying slowly. Even other Space Marine chapters, or at least individual Marines from those chapters, who recognized that the Lion's approach was more effective than the hidebound tactics that had failed for centuries. The Lion moved from world to world, always hunting, always fighting, always pushing back against the tide of chaos and Xeno's aggression that threatened to overwhelm Imperium Nihilus. He developed a network of contacts and allies, established supply lines and communication protocols, built the foundations of what would become a significant military force, all without official sanction from the Administratum, all without working through normal imperial channels, all through the sheer force of his will and the authority inherent in being one of the Emperor's sons. But the Lion knew that this could not last indefinitely. Eventually, he would need to reunite with the greater Imperium, would need to coordinate with whatever forces remained loyal to the Emperor on the other side of the Great Rift. He needed information about what had happened during his long sleep, about the current state of the Imperium, about whether any of his brothers had also survived and returned. And it was while seeking this information that the Lion received news that changed everything. One of the Risen had intercepted communications suggesting that not only had Roboute Guilliman returned to the Imperium, but that a massive battle was brewing, one that would determine the fate of entire sectors. The forces of chaos were gathering for some grand ritual, some working of dark power that could shift the balance of the entire war. The Lion recognized an opportunity. If he could intervene in this battle, could make contact with loyalist forces, could demonstrate the strength of the Risen and the Lion Guard, he might be able to forge an alliance that could truly make a difference in the war. More than that, he might finally be able to reconnect with his brothers, with the greater Imperium, with the legacy he had left behind 10,000 years ago. But to do that, he would need to reach the battle space. And traveling through normal warp routes was both too slow and too dangerous, especially given the current instability of the warp. The Lion would need to use the ability he had learned during his time in Mirror Caliban, the technique that the Watchers had taught him, whether they had meant to or not. He would need to walk the forest paths, to step between reality and dream, to traverse the spaces that existed between the material and the immaterial. The Lion was about to undertake a journey that would take him to a world called Wormwood, to a battle against forces that threatened not just Imperium Nihilus, but the entire galaxy. He was about to reunite with allies he had not seen in 10,000 years, face enemies that had been building their power for millennia, and confront a demon Primarch in single combat. The Lion was going to war, and this time the whole galaxy would know that he had returned. The meeting with Dante and journey to war. The Blood Angels' strike cruiser Absolution's ire hung in the void, like a shard of crimson hope in an ocean of darkness. Its approach to the coordinates where the Lion had requested a rendezvous was cautious, sensors sweeping for threats, weapons arrays charged and ready. In the dark side of the galaxy, trust was a luxury that could get entire crews killed. Even when the one requesting the meeting claimed to be a returned Primarch. Commander Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, and one of the oldest living space marines in the galaxy, stood on the bridge and studied the tactical displays with eyes that had witnessed over 1,000 years of warfare. He had received the Lion's message through intermediaries. Guinea-coded transmissions passed through networks that barely functioned in the chaos of Imperium Nihilus. The message had been simple. Meet me. We have much to discuss. The Imperium needs us both. Dante was skeptical, as any warrior who had survived as long as he had would be. Rumors of returned Primarchs had circulated before, always proving to be false hopes, or worse, elaborate traps set by enemies who knew how desperately humanity longed for its ancient heroes to return. He had believed such stories before and learned bitter lessons about the cost of false faith. But there was something about this message that felt different. The tactical information it contained about chaos movements in the sector, the intelligence about planned attacks that the Blood Angels had independently verified, the sheer audacity of claiming to be Lion L. Johnson. The first, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, suggested that whoever was behind this was either genuinely the Lion or someone with resources and knowledge far beyond what any normal imposter should possess. As the Absolution's ire approached the designated coordinates, its sensors detected a ship that should not exist. It was Dark Angels in configuration, but its signature was wrong, as if it had been modified in ways that deviated from standard chapter protocols. And standing on the hull, unarmored, exposed to the void, as if he were simply taking a walk on a pleasant day, was a figure that could only be a Primarch. Dante ordered his ship to hold position, sent a shuttle to retrieve this impossible figure, and prepared himself for whatever revelation was about to unfold. Or when the shuttle returned and the Lion stepped onto the bridge of the Absolution's ire, Dante felt something he had not experienced in centuries: genuine awe. The Lion was smaller than Dante had imagined, but then, all the Primarchs were merely human-sized compared to the legends that had grown around them over 10,000 years. But there was something about his presence that filled the bridge, a weight of authority and power that made even hardened veterans instinctively stand straighter. His face was aged in ways that defied the perpetual youth that Primarchs were supposed to possess, weathered and marked by time in a manner that suggested he had lived through his 10,000 years of sleep, rather than simply being preserved, unchanged. But his eyes, those were the eyes of a Primarch, sharp and calculating, after measuring everyone and everything in the room with a warrior's assessment. When they fell on Dante, there was recognition there, though the Lion had never met this particular chapter master. He was recognizing not the individual, but what he represented: a loyal servant of the Emperor, a warrior who had dedicated his entire extended life to protecting humanity. "Commander Dante," the Lion said, and his voice carried easily through the bridge without needing to raise it, compelling attention by its very timbre. "I am Lion L. Johnson, returned from a sleep of 10 millennia. I know you have no reason to trust my claim and every reason to doubt it, but time is short, and I have information about the enemy's movements that may prove my identity more convincingly than any oath or declaration." Dante gestured for the Lion to approach the tactical displays, keeping his hand near his weapon, but not drawing it. The Lion showed no offense at this caution, merely acknowledged it with a nod that suggested he would have done the same in Dante's position. The Primarch began to speak, laying out intelligence about chaos forces gathering in the Somnium stars, about a ritual being prepared by something called Vashtor the Archifane, about a construct called the Key that could reshape the balance of power in the entire galaxy. As the Lion spoke, Dante found his skepticism fading. This was not the speech of a pretender or a chaos trick. This was the analysis of a military genius who could see patterns in intelligence reports that would escape lesser minds, who could extrapolate enemy intentions from fragmentary data, who understood grand strategy in ways that only someone who had planned campaigns during the Great Crusade could understand. But it was when the Lion mentioned Robert Guilliman that Dante knew with absolute certainty that this was genuine. The Lion spoke of his brother with a mixture of respect and rivalry that could not be faked, showed concern about how Guilliman was managing the Imperium Sanctus, wondered aloud whether his brother's diplomatic approach would be sufficient for the challenges they now faced. These were not the thoughts of an imposter trying to convince others of his identity. These were the private reflections of a brother thinking about family. "You truly do not know," Dante said, interrupting the Lion's tactical analysis. "About Lord Guilliman, I mean. You speak as if his return is merely rumoured, not confirmed." The Lion turned his full attention on Dante, and the chapter master suddenly understood what it must have been like for ordinary humans to face the Emperor during the Great Crusade. That presence, that sense of being examined down to your very soul by something far beyond human limitations. "I have been isolated in Imperium Nihilus," the Lion said carefully. "I have heard rumours, fragmentary reports, but nothing confirmed. You speak as if you have personal knowledge of my brother's status." Dante nodded slowly. "Lord Guilliman lives, He was resurrected by the Eldar, blessed by the Emperor himself, and has taken up the role of Lord Commander of the Imperium. I have fought beside him, have seen him with my own eyes, have received orders directly from him. Whatever you heard, whatever you hoped, it is true. Your brother has returned. The lion was silent for a long moment, processing this information with the same tactical focus he brought to everything else. Then, to Dante's surprise, something that might have been a smile flickered across the Primarch's weathered face. "Good," the lion said simply. "Guilliman was always better suited to the administrative aspects of empire building than I was. He can manage the Imperium Sanctus, restore some semblance of order to the bureaucracy, coordinate the broader strategic picture, while I—" He trailed off, gesture encompassing the dark void beyond the ship's hull. "I will do what I do best. I'll hunt the enemies of humanity in the places where light no longer reaches." Dante found himself making a decision that would have profound consequences for everything that followed. He believed the lion, not just intellectually, not just because the evidence suggested this was genuine, but on a deeper, more fundamental level. This was one of the Emperor's sons, returned to lead humanity in its darkest hour. The Blood Angels would follow him. "The Dark Angels and their successor chapters will wish to know of your return," Dante said carefully. "They have been hunting the fallen for 10,000 years, have made that hunt the defining purpose of their existence. When they learn that you have not only returned, but are gathering some of those same fallen to your side—" "Let me worry about my sons," the lion interrupted. Not harshly, but with absolute finality. "They have forgotten what I taught them during the Great Crusade. They have allowed shame and secrecy to consume them, have prioritized hiding an ancient mistake over serving the Emperor's greater purpose. I will remind them of their true duty when the time comes. But for now, I need your aid, Dante. The enemy is gathering for something significant in the Somnium stars. They have constructed a world there, a mockery of Caliban called Wormwood, and they are bringing together forces that could threaten entire sectors if not checked." Dante studied the tactical data the lion had brought, cross-referencing it with intelligence his own forces had gathered. The picture that emerged was deeply concerning. The Chaos forces were not just preparing for another raid or isolated assault, yet they were gathering for something far more significant, something that involved not just Space Marines and cultists, but a demon Primarch. "Angron," Dante said, recognizing the signatures in the intelligence reports. "The Red Angel of Horn. He has been summoned to Wormwood." "Yes," the lion confirmed. "My brother, twisted and enslaved by the Blood God. If he is there, it means the ritual is significant enough to warrant the attention of the Chaos Gods themselves. We must stop it, Dante, whatever the cost." Dante found himself agreeing, though he knew that assaulting Wormwood would be catastrophic from a casualty perspective. Angron was a Daemon Primarch now, not merely a fallen Space Marine who could be defeated through conventional tactics. He was a warp entity given form, powered by the endless rage of Khorne himself. Even for a loyal Primarch, facing Angron would be a battle of devastating proportions. The lion seemed to read Dante's concerns in his expression. "I know what you're thinking," the Primarch said. "Angron will be difficult to defeat, perhaps impossible to kill permanently. But we do not need to kill him, merely banish him back to the warp. And I have certain advantages that may prove decisive." He touched something at his waist, and for the first time, Dante noticed the magnificent shield that the lion carried, its surface shimmering with power that seemed almost divine. "The Emperor's shield," the lion said, noting Dante's attention. "A gift from my father, bestowed upon me during my time in Mirror Caliban. It has properties that even I do not fully understand, but I know it will serve against even a demon Primarch's fury. With this, and with the Risen, and with your Blood Angels, we have a chance to stop whatever ritual Vashtor is planning." The two commanders, one a chapter master who had served for over 1,500 years, the other a Primarch awakened from 10 millennia of sleep, spent hours planning the assault. The lion displayed the same tactical brilliance that had made him famous during the Great Crusade, seeing solutions and opportunities that would have escaped even skilled strategists. Dante contributed knowledge of how modern warfare was conducted, how the Imperium's forces now operated, how chaos had adapted and evolved over the millennia. Together, they crafted a plan that had at least some chance of success. The Blood Angels would make a frontal assault on Wormwood, drawing the attention of the Chaos forces and the fury of Angron himself. Meanwhile, the Lion would use his mysterious forest-walking ability to appear on the battlefield at a crucial moment, turning the tide when it seemed all was lost. It was risky, relying on too many factors that could easily go wrong, but it was the best option they had. As preparations were made and coordinates were set, Dante found himself talking with the Lion about matters beyond pure tactics, about the state of the Imperium, about how far humanity had fallen from the Emperor's vision, about whether there was any hope of truly defeating chaos or merely holding it at bay for another few millennia. The Lion was surprisingly candid in these conversations, perhaps because he recognized in Dante a kindred spirit, someone who had dedicated their entire existence to protecting humanity, it who had seen the best and worst of what the Imperium could be, who carried the weight of impossible duty without complaint. The Imperium, my brother Guilliman, has returned to is not the one we left, the Lion said during one of these conversations. It has become a theocratic nightmare, worshipping my father as a god, despite his explicit rejection of such veneration. It has stagnated technologically, regressed culturally, become corrupt and inefficient in ways that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade. And yet it endures, Dante replied. Against all odds, against every enemy, through 10,000 years of constant warfare and decline, it endures. Perhaps that is enough. The Lion considered this, then nodded slowly. Perhaps, but I find myself unwilling to settle for mere endurance when restoration might be possible. Or Guilliman will work through official channels, will attempt to reform the Imperium from within, using his authority as Lord Commander to gradually improve things. That is his way, and it may well succeed in the long term. And your way? Dante asked. I will protect what needs protecting, the Lion said simply. I will destroy what needs destroying. I will not waste time on politics or bureaucracy or managing the sensitivities of officials who care more about their power than their duty. In Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the Emperor's light, I will be the Emperor's sword. Where I find corruption, I will burn it out. Where I find competence and loyalty, I will support it. And where I find enemies of humanity, I will annihilate them. It was a statement that revealed much about how the Lion intended to operate in this new age. Well, not as a traditional Primarch, working within the system he was supposed to serve, but as something more primal and dangerous. A knight-errant, beholden to no authority save his own judgment and his loyalty to the Emperor's original vision. The journey to Wormwood began with the Absolution's ire and its escorts making all possible speed toward the Somnium stars. The Lion traveled with them, but as they drew closer to their destination, he spent more time in meditation, preparing himself for what was to come. Dante noticed that sometimes the Primarch would simply vanish for hours at a time, only to reappear without explanation, as if he had stepped out of reality itself and then stepped back in. When Dante asked about this, the Lion explained about Mirror Caliban and the forest paths he could walk, and about how his connection to this strange realm allowed him to traverse distances that would normally require warp travel. It was a useful ability, certainly, but also deeply strange. A reminder that the Primarchs were not simply enhanced humans, but beings who existed partially outside the normal rules of reality. As they approached Wormwood, as the sensors began to pick up the massive chaos fleet surrounding this twisted demon world, Dante prepared his forces for the assault they were about to undertake. He had fought demon Primarchs before, had stood against Chaos's greatest champions, had led his forces through battles that should have been unwinnable. But he had never done so with a loyal Primarch at his side, never had the advantage of Lion L. Johnson's tactical genius and personal prowess. The Lion stood on the bridge of the Absolution's ire as they made their final approach, watching the twisted planet growing larger on the view screens. Wormwood was a mockery of Caliban, a chaos-corrupted version of his lost homeworld, and seeing it filled the Primarch with cold fury. This was a personal affront, an insult directed specifically at him by enemies who wanted him to know that they could desecrate even his memories. "They have made a mistake," the lion said quietly, though his voice carried through the bridge. "They thought to wound me by creating this twisted reflection of my home. Instead, they have given me additional motivation to destroy them utterly. Wormwood will burn, the ritual will fail, and those who created this abomination will learn why I am called the Lion." Dante, standing beside the Primarch, she felt a surge of confidence despite the overwhelming odds they faced. With the lion at their side, victory seemed possible. Not certain, not guaranteed, but possible. And in the grim darkness of the 42nd millennium, possibility was all any commander could hope for. The assault was about to begin. The Blood Angels would strike at the heart of the enemy, and the lion would walk the forest paths to appear at the crucial moment. Together, they would face a demon Primarch and stop a ritual that could doom entire sectors to chaos. The fate of Imperium Nihilus, perhaps the fate of the entire Imperium, hung in the balance. The lion was ready. After 10,000 years of sleep, after months of hunting through the shadows of Imperium Nihilus, after gathering the Risen and building the Lion Guard, he was finally about to show the galaxy that he had returned. And the enemies of humanity would learn that the first had not grown weak or soft during his long sleep. He had only become more dangerous. The Battle of Wormwood and Angron's Fury. Wormwood hung in the void like a corrupted jewel, a world that should not exist, given form by the malevolent will of chaos. From orbit, it appeared almost beautiful in a horrible way. Vast forests covered its surface, but these were not the natural woods of a living planet. They were mechanical constructions, clockwork trees of brass and iron, their branches moving with jerky precision that suggested the ticking of vast gears beneath the surface. Between the forests ran rivers of molten metal, and great spires of twisted architecture jutted toward the void like accusing fingers. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters had gathered a massive fleet, nearly legion strength, when all the various elements were combined. They had followed intelligence extracted from captured chaos cultists, had tracked the movements of Vashtor's forces with obsessive precision, and had arrived at Wormwood determined to stop whatever ritual was being prepared here. But they had arrived to find themselves outnumbered and outgunned, facing not just the Arcaphanes' forces, but also elements of the Black Legion, World Eaters, and a host of demonic entities. Supreme Grandmaster Azrael, leader of the Dark Angels, stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the tactical displays with growing dread. The enemy fleet was larger than expected, more heavily armed, better coordinated. Worse, the planetary defenses were formidable, are studded with weapon emplacements and void shields that would make any assault costly beyond measure. But retreat was not an option. Whatever was happening on Wormwood, whatever ritual Vashtor was conducting, it had to be stopped. The assault began with the Dark Angels fleet launching waves of attack craft and drop pods toward the planet's surface. The return fire was devastating, batteries of chaos weaponry tearing through void shields and armor plating with contemptuous ease. Ships that had served the Emperor for centuries were reduced to burning wrecks in moments. But the Dark Angels pressed on, driven by determination and desperation in equal measure. On the surface of Wormwood, the situation was even worse. The Dark Angels who managed to make planetfall found themselves in a nightmare landscape, fighting through forests that moved and changed around them, facing enemies that seemed to manifest from the very ground itself, and presiding over it all, coordinating the defense with terrifying efficiency, was Angron. The Daemon Primarch of Khorne had been summoned specifically for this battle, brought forth from the warp by rituals that would have required the sacrifice of millions. He stood at the center of the defenses, a towering figure of brass and rage, his very presence warping reality around him. Where he walked, the ground cracked and bled. Where he struck with his weapons, reality screamed. He was no longer the tragic figure who had led the World Eaters during the heresy. No longer a Primarch tormented by the butcher's nails implanted in his skull. He was something beyond that now. A demon given form and purpose by the blood god's will. Angron tore through the Dark Angel's assault with contemptuous ease, killing dozens with every swing of his massive chain axes. He laughed as he killed, a sound like grinding metal and breaking bones, delighting in the slaughter as only a servant of Horn could. The Dark Angels threw everything they had at him: tactical squads, assault marines, terminators, even entire companies led by veteran officers. And it was not enough. Angron was simply too powerful, too fast, too filled with demonic might to be stopped by conventional means. Azrael realized with sickening certainty that they were going to lose. The assault was failing, the casualties mounting beyond acceptable levels, and Angron was pushing toward his position with single-minded fury. Soon the demon Primarch would break through the last defensive lines, would reach the command elements of the Dark Angel's force, and then the battle would be well and truly lost. It was at this desperate moment that new signals appeared at the edge of the system. Blood Angels, marked by their crimson armor and their fury, arriving in numbers that suggested they had brought a significant portion of their chapter to this battle. At their head was the Absolution's ire, and leading them was Commander Dante himself, one of the oldest and most respected chapter masters in the Imperium. Azrael felt hope kindle despite the desperate situation. The Blood Angels were legendary warriors, and Dante's tactical acumen was beyond question. With their aid, the assault might still succeed. But even as relief washed through him, Azrael wondered how Dante had known to come here, how the Blood Angels had arrived at precisely the moment they were needed most. Dante's assault from orbit was as precise as it was devastating. The Blood Angels had studied the Dark Angel's initial attack, had seen where the defenses were strongest and where they were vulnerable, and had adjusted their approach accordingly. Drop pods containing Sanguinary Guard, the chapter's most elite warriors, screamed down toward Wormwood's surface like meteors of gold and red, targeting specific choke points where they could relieve pressure on the beleaguered Dark Angels. And Dante himself led from the front, as he always had, descending toward the tower where Angron was massacring the last defenders. But the ancient chapter master knew he could not defeat a demon Primarch in single combat. No normal Space Marine could, no matter how skilled or experienced. But he could buy time, could hold the line, could ensure that his brothers had a chance to complete their mission. The duel between Dante and Angron was titanic despite the vast difference in their power levels. Dante fought with every technique he had learned over 1,500 years of constant warfare, using his jump pack to stay mobile, striking at joints and weak points, doing everything possible to avoid Angron's devastating counterattacks. His Sanguinary Guard fought beside him, these golden-armored elites throwing themselves at the demon Primarch with suicidal bravery. But it was not enough. It could never have been enough. Angron's fury was limitless, his power fueled by the endless rage of Horn himself. He struck down the Sanguinary Guard one by one, their golden armor no more protection than paper against his demonic strength. And then he turned his full attention on Dante, recognizing in this ancient warrior a worthy offering to the blood god. The blow that finally felled Dante should have killed him outright. Angron's chain axe, driven with the full force of a Daemon Primarch's strength, caught Dante across his chest and shoulder, shattering ceramite and tearing through the reinforced musculature beneath. Dante crashed to the ground, his artificer armor sparking and failing, his vision graying from blood loss and trauma. Angron stood over the fallen chapter master, savoring the moment before the kill. Here was a warrior who had served the false emperor for over a millennium, who had led the Blood Angels with skill and devotion, who represented everything that Angron had once been before his ascension to demonhood. Killing him would be a significant offering, a worthy sacrifice to Khorne. The demon Primarch raised his weapons for the final strike, and then, impossibly, those weapons were stopped mid-swing, turned aside by a shield that blazed with golden light so bright it seemed to burn away the corruption of Wormwood itself. The lion had arrived. he emerged from what appeared to be thin air, stepping out of a spectral forest that existed for just a moment before fading away. The Emperor's shield, that divine artifact that had been gifted to him during his time in Mirror Caliban, caught Angron's attack and reflected it back with equal force, sending the demon Primarch staggering backward in shock. The lion stood over Dante's fallen form, his weathered face set in an expression of cold fury that was somehow more terrifying than Angron's rage could ever be. This was not the mindless wrath of Horn. This was the calculated anger of a warrior who had been betrayed by a brother, who had slept for 10,000 years while the galaxy burned, who had returned to find everything he had fought for corrupted and decayed. "Brother," the lion said, and his voice cut through the din of battle like a blade. "You have fallen far indeed, to serve powers that care nothing for you or the legion you once led. But I am here to end your rampage, to send you screaming back to the warp where you belong. You wanted battle, Angron. You shall have it." Angron, recovering from his shock at the lion's sudden appearance, let out a roar that shattered what few intact windows remained on the tower. The recognition was there in his demonic eyes. This was Lion L. Johnson, the first, the brother he had known during the Great Crusade. But recognition brought no hesitation, no mercy. Angron served Horn now, and the blood god cared only for slaughter. That this slaughter might involve a Primarch merely made it more worthy. The duel that followed would be remembered in Imperial histories for millennia to come, though few who witnessed it survived to tell the tale. Primarch fought Primarch across the ruins of Wormwood, their weapons clashing with such force that reality itself seemed to buckle under the strain. Angron fought with pure demonic rage, every strike intended to kill, every movement driven by the endless fury that the blood god had granted him. While his chain axes sang their horrible song, and where they struck, they left reality bleeding. But the lion fought differently. This was not rage, but cold precision, not mindless fury, but calculated violence. Every parry was perfect. Every counterstrike aimed at a vulnerability that only a Primarch's enhanced perception could detect. The Emperor's shield turned aside attacks that should have been unstoppable, while the lion's sword fealty found gaps in Angron's defenses that should not have existed. The lion had learned things during his time in Mirror Caliban, had remembered techniques from his youth that he had half forgotten during the Great Crusade. He fought like the hunter he had been in those early years, patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Angron, for all his demonic power, was not a subtle fighter, being he was rage incarnate, and rage could be predicted, could be exploited. The turning point came when Angron overextended, putting all his strength into a strike that would have cleaved even a Primarch in two if it had landed. The lion caught the blow on the Emperor's shield, and the divine artifact did what it was designed to do. It reflected the attack back at its source. Angron, struck by the full force of his own blow, staggered backward, his defenses opened for just a moment. That moment was all the lion needed. Fealty, that magnificent sword that had been forged specifically for the lion during his gathering of the Risen, found the gap in Angron's throat. The Primarch drove the blade home with all his strength, using Angron's own momentum against him, forcing the demon's head back as the sword pierced through what passed for his neck. Angron screamed, a sound of rage and pain that echoed across Wormwood and into the warp itself. His form began to destabilize, the demonic essence that sustained him unraveling as the wound proved too severe even for Khorne's power to immediately heal. The lion did not relent, driving the sword deeper, channeling every ounce of his will into banishing this corrupted reflection of his brother. And then the Emperor's shield, held in the lion's other hand, struck Angron's skull with devastating force. The divine power within the shield, the blessing of the Emperor himself, proved too much for the demon Primarch to withstand. With a final roar of defiance and fury, Angron's form exploded into warp energy, while his essence cast back into the realm of chaos from whence it had come. The battle was not over. Chaos forces still fought across Wormwood, and Vashtor's ritual was still progressing in the depths of the mechanical forests. But the lion's victory over Angron had turned the tide psychologically, if not numerically. The Dark Angels and Blood Angels rallied, inspired by their Primarch's triumph, fighting with renewed determination. The Risen, the lion's redeemed fallen, emerged from the forest paths and struck at key targets with devastating precision. The lion himself turned his attention to rescuing Dante, using his strength to lift the gravely wounded chapter master and carry him to safety. As he did so, Dark Angel's warriors stared in shock and confusion at their returned Primarch. They had not known he lived, but had not been informed that he had awakened, and yet here he was, larger than life, having just defeated a demon Primarch in single combat. Azrael, arriving at the lion's position with a bodyguard of Deathwing Terminators, fell to his knees in shock and reverence. "My lord," he stammered, "you live. After all these years, you truly live." "I do," the lion confirmed, his voice grim as he surveyed the battlefield. "And we will speak of many things, Azrael. About the hunt for the fallen, about the choices you and your predecessors have made, about what the Dark Angels have become in my absence. But that conversation will wait. Right now, we have a battle to win and a ritual to stop. Gather your forces. We advance on Vashtor's position." The combined forces of Dark Angels, Blood Angels, and the Risen fought their way toward the heart of Wormwood, where Vashtor the Archifani was completing his ritual. They were too late to stop it entirely. The demon had succeeded in uniting various ancient artifacts into something he called the Key, a device of terrible power that could potentially unlock secrets that predated even the old ones who had once ruled the galaxy. As Wormwood itself began to buckle and tear, as reality warped around the completed Key, the lion recognized that remaining on the planet would mean death or worse. He ordered a full retreat, using his forest walking ability to create escape routes for his forces. The Dark Angels and Blood Angels evacuated in barely controlled chaos, fighting desperate rearguard actions as they retreated to their ships. The lion was the last to leave Wormwood, and standing on the planet's surface and watching as Vashtor and Abaddon escaped with their prize. It was a bitter victory at best. They had banished Angron and saved most of the Imperial forces, but the ritual had succeeded. The Key existed now, and whatever lock it was meant to open would shake the foundations of the galaxy. But the lion took comfort in one thing. He had announced his return in the most dramatic way possible. He had shown the Imperium and its enemies alike that the First had not died, that he had merely been sleeping, and that he was now awake and ready to wage war once more. News of his victory over Angron would spread, and with it, hope would return to places that had known only despair. Standing on the bridge of the Absolution's ire as Wormwood disappeared into the warp behind them, and the lion accepted a new title that Commander Dante bestowed upon him with the authority of one who had fought beside a Primarch and earned the right to speak plainly. "Knight of Nihilus," Dante said, his wounds tended by the chapter's apothecaries, but still grave enough to require extended recovery. "Protector of the dark side of the galaxy, defender of those cut off from the Emperor's light. You have earned this title, Lord Lion, through blood and valor." The lion accepted the title with a nod, recognizing its appropriateness. He was indeed a knight in the truest sense, a warrior sworn to protect those who could not protect themselves. And Imperium Nihilus needed such a champion desperately. The dark side of the galaxy, cut off from terror by the Great Rift, required someone who could fight without the support of the greater Imperium, who could inspire hope through actions rather than words, who could be the Emperor's sword in places where the Emperor's light could no longer reach. The lion's awakening was complete. He had returned to the galaxy, had proven his worth in battle, had begun to build the forces that would allow him to truly make a difference in this desperate age. And he had only just begun. The galaxy would soon learn that the lion's return was not just another false hope, not just another legend to be disappointed by reality. Lionel Johnson was back, and he had every intention of reminding the Imperium's enemies why he was called the First. The Knight of Nihilus. In the wake of the Battle of Wormwood, as news of the lion's return spread through the scattered worlds of Imperium Nihilus like wildfire through dry timber. Yet the Primarch faced a choice about how he would operate in this new age. He had seen what the Imperium had become during his 10,000-year absence. He had witnessed the bureaucratic nightmares, the religious zealotry, the corruption and inefficiency that plagued every level of imperial government. Roboute Guillemot, his brother, had chosen to work within the system. As Lord Commander of the Imperium, Guillemot was attempting to reform the massive bureaucracy from the inside, using his authority to gradually improve the Imperium's functioning while maintaining stability and avoiding the chaos that complete revolution would bring. It was a logical approach, suited to Guillemot's strengths as an administrator and empire builder. But the Lion was not Guillemot. He had never been suited to administrative work. Baz had never possessed the patience for political maneuvering or bureaucratic reform. His talents lay elsewhere, in warfare, in hunting down threats and eliminating them with precision and ruthless efficiency. And Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the greater Imperium by the Great Rift, needed a protector more than it needed a reformer. The Lion decided to embrace his role as the Knight of Nihilus fully. He would not work through official channels, would not waste time requesting permission from distant bureaucrats who had no understanding of the situations on the ground. Instead, he would go directly to the people, would offer his protection to those who needed it, and would eliminate threats wherever he found them. This approach made the Lion deeply popular among the common citizens and soldiers of Imperium Nihilus. When the Primarch arrived on a world, he did not present himself to the planetary governor and conduct formal negotiations. Instead, he went to the trenches where guard regiments held the line against Xenos incursions. He visited manufactorums where workers toiled to produce the weapons and supplies needed for the endless war. He walked among civilians who cowered in makeshift shelters, waiting for the next attack to come. And he judged. With a Primarch's perception and a lifetime of experience, the Lion could assess a situation in moments. He could see which leaders were genuinely trying to protect their people and which were merely using their positions for personal gain. He could identify where resources were being wasted, where corruption had taken root, where incompetence endangered entire populations. As when the Lion found leadership that met his standards, officials who were competent, loyal to the Imperium's true purpose, and genuinely concerned with protecting their people, he would work with them. He would offer his aid, coordinate defenses, share intelligence, and ensure that these worlds received whatever support the Risen and the Lion Guard could provide. But when the Lion found corruption, incompetence, or self-serving behavior that endangered the very people these leaders were supposed to protect, he showed no mercy. Planetary governors who had grown fat on bribes, while their populations starved, found themselves removed from office and, in extreme cases, executed for dereliction of duty. Military commanders who sent their soldiers to die in pointless assaults while keeping themselves safe in fortified bunkers discovered that a Primarch's authority superseded any rank or privilege they might claim. This direct approach, this willingness to bypass normal imperial hierarchy and work directly with the people doing the actual fighting and dying, made the Lion beloved by many. But it also made him deeply unpopular among the Imperium's ruling classes, who saw in him a threat to their authority and privileges. Complaints were filed with the administratum, protests were lodged with the ecclesiarchy, formal grievances were submitted through every bureaucratic channel available. The Lion ignored them all, and he cared nothing for the opinions of distant bureaucrats who would never see the battlefields where humanity fought for its survival. He answered to one authority only, the Emperor himself, and the Emperor's purpose was clear: protect humanity from extinction. Everything else was secondary. The Lion's approach to military operations was similarly direct. When he identified a threat to imperial worlds, whether chaos incursions, Xenos raiders, or human traitors, he did not request permission to engage, did not wait for approval from higher authorities. He simply attacked, using the Risen and the Lion Guard to strike at enemies with devastating precision. His use of the forest walking ability gave the lion a tactical advantage that few commanders in the modern Imperium possessed. He could move his forces across vast distances without relying on conventional warp travel, could appear on battlefields where he was least expected, could coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Enemies who thought themselves safe in their strongholds discovered that nowhere was truly safe when the lion was hunting them. The Risen, his force of redeemed fallen, proved to be invaluable in these operations. These were space marines who had survived for 10,000 years in hostile territory, who had learned to adapt and improvise, who possessed experience and cunning that even veteran Dark Angels lacked. They operated in small teams, striking at key targets with surgical precision, and their loyalty to the lion was absolute, born from genuine redemption rather than mere obedience to the chain of command. But perhaps the lion's most significant impact on Imperium Nihilus was psychological rather than military. His very presence, the fact that one of the Emperor's sons walked among humanity once more, gave people hope in a way that no amount of propaganda or religious rhetoric could match. When soldiers saw the lion fighting beside them, when civilians witnessed a Primarch defending their homes, when entire worlds learned that they were under the lion's protection, it changed their perception of the war they were fighting. This was not merely holding the line until inevitable defeat. This was not just buying time while the Imperium slowly collapsed around them. The lion's return suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, humanity could actually win. That the long retreat could be reversed, that the endless darkness could be pushed back, that the Emperor's vision might yet be realized. The lion understood this psychological impact and used it deliberately. He made sure that word of his victories spread, that stories of his battles against Chaos and Xenos were told and retold across Imperium Nihilus. He appeared personally before Imperial Guard regiments, about to face desperate battles, lending them courage through his presence. He walked through refugee camps, spoke with civilians who had lost everything, and promised them that he would protect what remained. But the lion also had to confront the reality of what his own sons, the Dark Angels, and their successor chapters had become during his absence. The obsessive hunt for the fallen, the secrecy and shame that had consumed the unforgiven chapters, the willingness to abandon allies mid-battle if pursuing a fallen took priority, all of this was antithetical to what the lion had taught during the Great Crusade. When Azrael and other leaders of the Unforgiven came to the lion seeking guidance and approval, they expected the Primarch to praise their dedication to hunting the fallen. Instead, they found themselves facing a father who was deeply disappointed in what his sons had become. "You have allowed shame to define you," the lion told them, his voice cold with disapproval. "You have prioritized hiding an ancient mistake over serving the Emperor's greater purpose. You have abandoned allies, concealed information from fellow Imperial forces, and turned the hunt for the fallen into an obsession that serves no one but your own pride." The gathered commanders tried to explain. They tried to justify their actions as necessary to preserve the chapter's honor, to prevent the Imperium from learning about the betrayal on Caliban. But the lion would hear none of it. "I offer redemption to fallen who have remained loyal to the Emperor in their hearts," he said. "I gather them to my side, form them into the Risen, and send them to fight for the Imperium once more. Yet you, my supposedly loyal sons, continue to hunt and execute warriors who might have been valuable assets. This ends now." The lion issued new orders to the Unforgiven. They would continue hunting the fallen who had genuinely embraced chaos, who had become enemies of the Imperium in deed as well as name. But they would offer amnesty to those who showed genuine loyalty to the Emperor's cause. They would cooperate with other Imperial forces rather than maintaining their traditional isolation. And most importantly, they would remember that their primary duty was to protect humanity, not to preserve their own reputation. These orders were controversial, challenging 10,000 years of tradition and practice. Some within the Unforgiven embraced them, relieved to finally have direction from their Primarch, grateful for the chance to focus on actual enemies rather than ancient shame. Others resisted, unable to let go of the obsession that had defined their existence for so long. The lion made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated. "I am Lionel Johnson," he said to those who questioned his authority. "I created the First Legion, taught them everything they know about warfare and honor. I led them to victory in the Emperor's name. I have returned after 10,000 years to find that my sons have forgotten my teachings. This will be corrected, whether you embrace the correction willingly or require more direct intervention." Few dared to resist after that. The lion was not merely a symbolic figure or a distant commander. He was a primarch who could and would enforce his will through personal action if necessary. Those who could not accept his new direction found themselves removed from positions of authority, replaced by officers who understood that the hunt for the fallen was secondary to protecting the Imperium. As the lion's influence spread through Imperium Nihilus, as his victories mounted and his legend grew, something remarkable began to happen. The dark side of the galaxy, in cut off from terror and the Emperor's light, began to feel less isolated. The constant feeling of abandonment, the sense that they were forgotten by the greater Imperium and left to die slowly in the darkness, began to fade. The lion could not change the fundamental reality of the Great Rift or restore warp travel to what it had been before the galaxy split. But he could give the people of Imperium Nihilus something they had lacked for too long: a champion who would fight for them, a protector who would not abandon them, a leader who understood that their lives and struggles mattered. Stories spread of the cowled giant, the mysterious figure who appeared from mist-wreathed forests to strike down the enemies of humanity. Tales were told of the unforgiving knight, and who showed no mercy to traitors, but offered redemption to those who had strayed through no fault of their own. Some even began to call him the Emperor Incarnate, seeing in the lion a reflection of what the Emperor himself might have been during the Great Crusade. The lion discouraged such religious veneration, uncomfortable with being worshipped just as his father had been uncomfortable with it during his lifetime. But he understood that he could not entirely control how people perceived him, and if their faith in him gave them strength to endure, he would not waste energy trying to correct every theological misunderstanding. Instead, the lion focused on what he did best: hunting the enemies of humanity. He tracked down chaos warbands that had terrorized entire sectors, eliminated their leaders, and scattered their forces. Yet he led campaigns against Xenos raiders, teaching them that Imperium Nihilus was no longer easy prey. He confronted rogue Imperial forces, traitor guard regiments, corrupted Space Marine chapters, ambitious warlords who sought to carve out their own petty kingdoms, and reminded them that they served the Emperor, not their own ambitions. And always, the lion walked the forest paths, using his mysterious connection to Mirror Caliban to traverse distances that should have been impassable. This ability made him unpredictable, allowed him to strike where enemies thought themselves safe, gave him a mobility that conventional commanders could only dream of. The Knight of Nihilus had fully embraced his role. He was the Emperor's sword in the darkness, the protector of those cut off from the greater Imperium, the hunter who stalked the predators that preyed upon humanity. And as long as the Great Rift divided the galaxy, as long as Imperium Nihilus remained isolated and besieged, the lion would be there, fighting battles that no one else could win, offering hope where despair had reigned. The galaxy was changing, faster than it had in 10,000 years, with Guilliman leading the Imperium Sanctus and the lion protecting Imperium Nihilus, with two primarchs returned to guide humanity through its darkest hour. Perhaps the long decline could finally be arrested. Perhaps the Imperium could begin to rebuild, could rediscover something of the Emperor's original vision, or perhaps the darkness would consume everything anyway, and the return of the Primarchs would prove to be nothing more than a final bright flame before the eternal night fell. But if that darkness was coming, the lion intended to make it pay dearly for every inch of ground it claimed. The first would fight until the very end, protecting those who could not protect themselves, hunting the enemies of humanity with the same relentless determination that had characterized him since his earliest days in the forests of Caliban. The lion's awakening was complete. the Knight of Nihilus, had taken up his sword, raised his shield, and stepped into the endless war, and the enemies of humanity would learn to fear the name Lion L. Johnson once more. The Forest Walk and Mirror Caliban. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding the lion's return is the strange ability he developed during his long sleep, what came to be called the Forest Walk. This was not mere warp travel as practiced by the Imperium's ships, and nor was it the webway technology that the Elder utilized. It was something unique, something that seemed to exist at the intersection of the warp and reality, a technique that only the lion could use. The origins of this ability lay in Mirror Caliban, that impossible realm where the lion had spent his 10,000-year sleep. Mirror Caliban was not simply a dream or a psychic construct. It was a real place, existing in the spaces between the material universe and the warp, a reflection of the lost world of Caliban, as it had been before corruption and war destroyed it. The exact nature of Mirror Caliban remained unclear even to the lion himself. It seemed to exist as a kind of pocket dimension, accessible only through specific methods, and only to those who had a connection to the original Caliban. The Watchers in the Dark moved through it freely, suggesting they had created or maintained this realm for purposes of their own. But they offered no explanations, speaking only in riddles when they deigned to speak at all. What the lion had discovered during his time in Mirror Caliban was that the realm was not fixed in a single location. Rather, it seemed to underlie all of reality, or at least significant portions of it. The forests of Mirror Caliban connected to many places in the material universe, creating pathways that could be walked by those who knew how to perceive them. Learning to use these pathways had been a gradual process for the lion. At first, during his initial awakening, he had stumbled through Mirror Caliban almost randomly, emerging at locations he did not consciously choose. But as his memories returned and his understanding deepened, he began to develop a sense of how the forest paths worked, how to navigate them intentionally, how to use them to traverse vast distances in the material universe. The process of forest walking was not simple teleportation. It required the lion to actually step into Mirror Caliban, to physically walk through the spectral forests until he found the path that led to his desired destination, and then to step back out into the material world. The time spent in Mirror Caliban did not necessarily correspond to time in the material universe. The lion might walk for hours in the spectral forest and emerge only moments after he left reality, or he might take a single step and find that hours had passed outside. But the tactical advantages were enormous. That the lion could bypass enemy defenses entirely, appearing behind battle lines that would normally require days or weeks to penetrate. He could coordinate attacks across multiple worlds simultaneously, using the forest paths to rapidly redeploy his forces. He could escape from situations that would trap conventional forces, simply stepping into Mirror Caliban when retreat through normal means was impossible. The Risen, particularly those who had maintained some connection to Caliban through their long exile, sometimes accompanied the lion on these forest walks. They described the experience as deeply unsettling, walking through woods that felt familiar yet wrong, seeing landscapes that matched their memories of Caliban but overlaid with strangeness, sensing presences that watched from the shadows without ever fully revealing themselves. For the lion, however, the forest walk felt almost natural. These were the forests of his youth, or close enough to them that the difference hardly mattered. He had survived alone in such woods for 10 years before Luther found him. He knew how to read the signs, how to find paths through apparently impenetrable undergrowth, how to sense danger before it manifested. These skills, honed in his earliest years, translated directly to navigating Mirror Caliban. But the forest walk was not without risks. Mirror Caliban, existing as it did between reality and the warp, was subject to influences from both sides. Demon entities sometimes found their way into the spectral forests, attracted by the psychic resonance of the lion's passage. Creatures that had been warped by chaos stalked through the woods, while hunting for prey that did not belong in their realm. The lion dealt with these threats as he had dealt with the great beasts of Caliban during his youth, by hunting them first. He carried weapons even when walking the forest paths, ready to fight at a moment's notice. The Risen who accompanied him quickly learned to remain vigilant, never allowing themselves to be lulled by the beauty of Mirror Caliban's forests or the seeming peace of its clearings. There were also sections of Mirror Caliban that the Lion avoided, areas where corruption had taken root, or where the barrier between this realm and deeper parts of the warp had grown dangerously thin. These were marked by obvious signs: trees that bled, undergrowth that writhed with unnatural life, clearings where the light seemed to drain away rather than illuminate. But the Watchers sometimes appeared in these places, warning the Lion away, suggesting that not all of Mirror Caliban was safe even for a Primarch. One location in particular drew the Lion's attention repeatedly: the domed structure he had seen during his initial awakening, the building that the Watchers had warned him against entering. It still stood in Mirror Caliban, visible through the trees, calling to him in ways he did not fully understand. The Lion sometimes found himself walking toward it without consciously choosing to do so, drawn by something inside that resonated with his very being. But he always stopped before reaching it, heeding the Watcher's warning. He was not yet strong enough, not yet ready for whatever revelation or challenge waited within that structure. Perhaps one day, when his understanding of Mirror Caliban was complete, when he had fully mastered the forest walk and understood his connection to this strange realm, he would enter and learn what secrets it held. And then there was the Fisher King, that wounded figure the Lion had seen beside the river during his awakening. The Lion encountered him occasionally during his forest walks, always in the same position, always fishing in the same stretch of river, always surrounded by the same dark shadows that prevented approach. The Watchers had identified him as a king in pain, waiting for the right question, for healing that only the Lion could provide. But the Lion did not yet know what question to ask, what healing to offer. He understood, on some instinctive level, that this figure represented something important, in some key to understanding Mirror Caliban and his own role in this strange realm. But until he had the knowledge to approach the Fisher King properly, all he could do was acknowledge the wounded monarch's presence and continue on his path. The Lion's ability to walk the forest paths became a significant tactical asset in his campaigns across Imperium Nihilus. His enemies quickly learned that conventional defenses were useless against a Primarch who could simply appear in the middle of their strongholds, bypassing walls and void shields and every other protection they might raise. This forced them to adapt their strategies, to assume that nowhere was truly safe when the Lion was on the hunt. Some tried to study the Lion's appearances, looking for patterns that might allow them to predict where he would strike next. But Mirror Caliban's paths were not constrained by conventional distance or geography. The Lion might emerge from the forest paths anywhere that met certain criteria, places with strong connections to Caliban's original nature, locations where the barrier between reality and the warp was thin, sites that held particular significance in the great game of chaos and order. The Eldar, with their own understanding of the webway and pocket dimensions, seemed particularly disturbed by the Lion's ability. When they encountered evidence of his forest walking, they withdrew more quickly than usual, as if recognizing something that exceeded their understanding. The few times Eldar representatives had to negotiate with the Lion, they showed unusual deference, yet treating him not merely as a powerful warrior, but as something that existed partially outside normal reality. The Lion himself remained philosophical about his unique ability. He saw it as a tool, like any weapon or piece of equipment, to be used in service of the Emperor's greater purpose. He did not claim to fully understand how it worked, or why he alone seemed capable of utilizing it. Perhaps it was connected to his 10 years of solitary survival in Caliban's forests. Perhaps the Watchers in the Dark had deliberately taught him during his long sleep. Perhaps it was simply another aspect of being a Primarch, one that had lain dormant until circumstances forced it to manifest. What mattered was that the forest walk gave the Lion an advantage in the endless war he was fighting. It allowed him to protect worlds that would otherwise have fallen, to strike at enemies who thought themselves beyond reach, to coordinate defenses across vast sections of Imperium Nihilus that had no conventional means of communication. And as the Lion grew more comfortable with Mirror Caliban, as his understanding deepened and his connection to the realm strengthened, new possibilities began to emerge. Could he teach others to walk the forest paths, or was this ability unique to him? Could the paths be used to transport larger forces, or were they limited to small groups? Could Mirror Caliban be fortified, turned into a refuge, or staging ground for operations throughout Imperium Nihilus? These were questions that would take time to answer, experimentation and understanding that could only come through continued use of the ability. But the Lion was patient in this regard, willing to explore and learn at a measured pace rather than rushing into applications that might prove dangerous or counterproductive. The forest walk remained one of the greatest assets the Lion possessed, a unique advantage that set him apart from every other commander in the Imperium. As long as he could walk the paths of Mirror Caliban, as long as he could step between reality and dream at will, the Lion would remain a threat that conventional tactics could not counter. And in a galaxy where conventional warfare had reached a brutal stalemate, where the same battles were being fought over and over with the same terrible results, the ability to do something unconventional, something that the enemy could not predict or prepare for, might make all the difference between humanity's survival and its extinction. The Lion's legacy and the future. As the Lion established himself as the Knight of Nihilus, as his victories mounted and his legend grew, questions began to arise about what his return meant for the future of the Imperium. Two Primarchs now walked among humanity once more. Roboute Guilliman in Imperium Sanctus and Lionel Johnson in Imperium Nihilus. Both were working toward the same ultimate goal of protecting humanity and preserving what remained of the Emperor's vision. But their methods and philosophies differed significantly. Guilliman represented order, administration, and reform through existing systems. He was working to rebuild the Imperium from within, using his authority as Lord Commander to gradually improve the massive bureaucracy that governed human space. He understood that radical change would cause chaos and instability that humanity could not afford in its current desperate state. His approach was measured, careful, focused on long-term sustainability rather than short-term dramatic action. The Lion represented direct action, personal judgment, and protection through strength. He was not trying to reform the Imperium's systems, but rather to defend its people despite those systems. He bypassed bureaucracy when it slowed him down, removed incompetent officials when they endangered their populations, and made decisions based on his own assessment of what needed to be done, rather than working through chains of command. These different approaches inevitably created tension. Our officials in Imperium Sanctus, hearing about the Lion's methods, worried about the precedent it set. If one Primarch could simply remove planetary governors on his own authority, what prevented other powerful figures from doing the same? If the chain of command could be bypassed whenever someone deemed it necessary, how could any coherent governance be maintained? But in Imperium Nihilus, cut off from the greater Imperium and facing existential threats on every side, the Lion's direct approach was not just appreciated, but desperately needed. Worlds that had been abandoned by distant bureaucrats, left to fend for themselves against impossible odds, found in the Lion a champion who actually cared about their survival. Not soldiers who had been ordered to die in pointless battles by incompetent commanders discovered that a Primarch would hold those commanders accountable. The differences between the brothers would need to be resolved eventually. When the Great Rift finally closed, or when warp travel improved enough to allow regular contact between the two halves of the Imperium, Guilliman and the Lion would have to reconcile their different approaches. There would need to be discussions, compromises, agreements about jurisdiction and authority. But that day was still far in the future. For now, the two Primarchs could operate independently, each doing what they did best in their respective regions of space. Guilliman could focus on rebuilding the administrative capacity of the Imperium, restoring some measure of efficiency and competence to government. Fourth, the Lion could focus on the immediate military threats, protecting populations that needed protection and destroying enemies that needed destruction. The relationship between the Lion and the Dark Angels chapter also remained complicated. Azrael and the other leaders of the Unforgiven were trying to adapt to having their Primarch back, trying to reconcile 10,000 years of tradition and practice with the Lion's new directives. Some within the chapter embraced the changes eagerly, relieved to have guidance from their father, glad to refocus on protecting humanity rather than hunting ghosts from the past. Others struggled with the transition. The hunt for the fallen had defined these warriors for so long that letting it go, even partially, felt like abandoning their very purpose. The Lion's acceptance of redeemed fallen into the risen was particularly controversial, challenging everything the inner circle had believed about shame and redemption. But the Lion was patient with his sons, recognizing that change would take time. He did not expect them to immediately abandon 10,000 years of tradition just because he had returned. He simply made clear what he expected, that they would remember their primary duty was to protect the Imperium, that they would offer redemption to those who deserved it, and that they would work with other Imperial forces rather than maintaining their traditional isolation. Those who could adapt to these expectations would continue to serve in the Dark Angels and their successor chapters. Those who could not would be reassigned to other duties, as where their particular obsessions could be indulged without compromising the chapter's overall effectiveness. It was not cruel, merely practical. The Lion needed warriors who could fight the Imperium's actual enemies, not those who were trapped in the past. The Risen, meanwhile, continued to grow as more fallen came to the Lion seeking redemption. Not all who came were accepted. The Lion's judgment was harsh and unforgiving toward those who had genuinely embraced chaos. But those who passed his tests, who demonstrated that their loyalty to the Emperor remained unbroken despite everything they had endured, found in the Risen a new purpose and a new brotherhood. These redeemed warriors brought with them thousands of years of experience, knowledge of enemy tactics that had been gathered through hard-won battles, and a dedication born from genuine gratitude rather than mere duty. They had been offered redemption when they expected only execution, had been welcomed home when they thought themselves forever exiled. Their loyalty to the Lion was absolute, tempered by understanding and choice, rather than simply demanded by chain of command. The Lion Guard, the human auxiliary forces that the Lion had begun gathering, also continued to expand. These were not just soldiers, but entire support networks, logistics experts who could keep forces supplied even when cut off from normal supply lines, intelligence operatives who could gather information in places where space marines would be too obvious, diplomats who could negotiate with planetary governments on the Lion's behalf, tech priests who could maintain equipment and repair vehicles in the field. Together, the Risen and the Lion Guard formed a military force that was more flexible and adaptable than traditional Space Marine chapter deployments. They could fight large-scale battles when needed, with the Risen providing the superhuman combat prowess that Space Marines were known for. But they could also conduct small team operations, intelligence gathering, and long-term occupation duties that pure Space Marine forces struggled with. The Lion's impact on the morale of Imperium Nihilus could not be overstated. Before his return, the dark side of the galaxy had felt abandoned, cut off from any hope of aid or rescue. The people there had been fighting a slow retreat, losing ground year by year, knowing that eventually the darkness would consume everything. The return of a Primarch changed that calculation entirely. Now there was hope, genuine hope rather than just propaganda and empty promises. The Lion's victories demonstrated that Chaos and Xenos forces could be beaten, that the long retreat could be stopped and even reversed. His direct approach to protecting civilian populations showed that someone in authority actually cared whether they lived or died. His willingness to hold corrupt officials accountable suggested that justice was still possible, even in this darkest of ages. Stories of the Lion spread across Imperium Nihilus, growing in the telling as such stories always do. Some were accurate: the defeat of Angron, the destruction of the 10,000 Eyes, the countless smaller victories in battles across dozens of worlds. Others were exaggerated or entirely fictional.
But tales of the lion, performing miracles or appearing simultaneously in multiple places to save besieged populations. The lion did not discourage these stories, recognizing their value in maintaining morale and hope. If people wanted to believe he was more than he was, if they needed to see him as a divine champion sent by the emperor himself, he would not waste energy trying to correct every misconception. What mattered was that they continued to fight, that they did not give in to despair, that they believed the war could still be won. But the lion also knew that his return alone was not enough to save the Imperium. Even with Guilliman working on the other side of the Great Rift, even with 2 Primarchs leading humanity's defense, the enemies they faced were too numerous and too powerful to be defeated through conventional means. But the Chaos Gods were eternal, fed by the very emotions and beliefs of sentient beings across the galaxy. The Tyrannid hive fleets were beyond counting, their numbers replenished faster than they could be destroyed. The Orcs bred and fought and multiplied without end, creating empires that crashed against Imperial space in waves that never truly ceased. What the Lion could do was buy time. He could hold the line in Imperium Nihilus, could prevent the complete collapse of human civilization on the dark side of the galaxy. He could inspire others to continue fighting when giving up would be so much easier. He could be the Emperor's sword in the darkness, cutting down threats and protecting the innocent. And perhaps, if the Imperium could hold on long enough, if enough Primarchs returned and enough heroes rose to meet the endless challenges, humanity might find a way to truly turn the tide. Perhaps the Emperor's original vision of a united, peaceful humanity ruling the galaxy could still be realized, or at least approached more closely than the nightmare theocracy that currently existed. The Lion did not know if such hopes were realistic or merely delusions. He had seen too much of the galaxy's darkness to have easy faith in ultimate victory. But he also knew that hope, even if ultimately futile, was necessary for survival. Without it, humanity would simply give up and die. With it, they might at least fight on long enough to see their children and grandchildren inherit something better than the current horror. So the Lion continued his work as Knight of Nihilus, protecting those who needed protection, destroying those who needed destruction, offering redemption to those who deserved it, and death to those who did not. He walked the forest paths of Mirror Caliban, appeared on battlefields where he was most needed, and reminded the enemies of humanity that the Emperor's sons were not all dead or corrupted. The future remained uncertain. The war would continue for generations, perhaps for millennia. But for now, in this moment, the Lion was awake and fighting, and as long as he drew breath, as long as he could wield sword and shield in the Emperor's name, the darkness would not go unopposed. The first had returned. The Knight of Nihilus had taken up his vigil, and the galaxy would never be the same. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Lionel Johnson's awakening and return to the galaxy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more Warhammer 40k lore content. The grim darkness of the far future holds countless stories, and we'll continue to explore them together, one tale at a time. Thank you for listening, and may the Emperor protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.